Hello Tesla Cats, this is Tesla-chan, or Lucy if you prefer, and welcome back to the garden. As promised, this is a compilation of prologues part 1 and 2, all the way through the current chapter of Chapter 4 of Hunters of Ryzoth. Viewer's discretion is advised, as this is a horror fanfiction series, and there are going to be dark themes mentioned. This is not meant for children, and will never be meant for children. With that said, stick around to the very end, where I give some final notes on the current state of Hunters of Ryzoth as a series. Hunters of Ryzoth, Pasta Sauce, Prologue, Part 1, Halloween Request. Under the pale moonlight, a woman walks home, grumbling obscenities as she does. Her gait is filled with agitation and purpose. She wasn't able to complete a task that she wanted to, and now she had to reevaluate her plan. If the others hadn't singled in on that asswipe last time, she muttered loudly, he would have been dead by now. Oh, but no, he seems to be prime victim material for every pasta and their brother. And now he's buffed his security, so getting to him is going to be a challenge without getting police involved. She paused, heaving a sigh as she felt a smile tug at her lips. I do love a challenge, she said, seeming oddly relaxed now, and his screams be worth it in the end. You really have changed, and not for the better, Celeste, chimed a voice that was all too familiar to the young woman. Father? She said, whipping around towards him with semi-surprise. You finally visit me after my disgrace 2 years ago now? The man looked at the young woman, some minor streaks of gray adorning his blonde hair. His eyes held an odd mixture of gentle kindness and sadness. They were a golden color. That point aside, I've got a request for you, he said, staring at the mask on his daughter's face. A request? Celeste almost laughed. If I'm a murderous failure and a disgrace, why should I care about an Esther's duty? I'm not one of you anymore. You made that clear. Nova. Her father tried to get a word in, but she interrupted. Why even try to make me feel loved? It's clear that I couldn't care less about my original job. So what, my dearest papa? She spat in anger and insane delight all at once. Her father remained silent for the briefest moment, before he spoke up. You may not be allowed to return to us. That said, I wouldn't have come to you if I had any alternative. She stalked up to him, making sure she was reading him correctly. His voice sounded tired. He even sounded a bit desperate. Nova pulled her mask back to look at her father's eyes more properly. Her fair skin made her glowing eyes pop more so, and they seemed to swirl slowly like a black hole sucking things into the center. Her father didn't seem to jump at this action from her, as he knew she wouldn't just attack him somehow. Nova backed up enough to allow her father to loosen his stance once more. So, she said, pulling the mask off of her head the rest of the way, you can't just send more Asters to try to rectify what's going on? As she stated this, she leaned against a nearby tree, holding the mask with her arms crossed underneath her boobs. Her father stared at her for a moment, seeming to be a bit surprised that she was even asking. Does this mean... he asked, seeming to sound somewhat hopeful. You know I can't tell you that, she said, her gaze coming from the corner of her eye. Not until I understand why me, of all people. Her father seemed to sigh, but he knew he wasn't going to get anywhere with her without a reason. She stayed still, seeming to wait for him to explain himself, all while gently swinging her mask in her loose grip. You are aware people are beginning to hunt down killers and demons in your group, correct? He asked, watching his daughter to read her. Nova hummed, seeming curious about this revelation. He watched her and said, there are human hunters trying to take out all manner of creepypastas. They say they're doing it out of the need to protect people. It seems to me they're doing what our kind would do if we wanted to keep people safer, Nova retorted, wondering what the point of bringing this up was. Her father took a step towards her and replied, "That's just it. They're trying to protect people, but in doing so, these hunters have raised some concerns. They have taken asters that haven't done anything, and found a way to mind control and trap all manner of demon, ghost, and creature. What's more, they seem to be wanting to revive something they could never control to fulfill their goals." As soon as her father brought up these facts, she seemed to be more focused. Her full face was turned towards him, and she seemed to be surprised that things were getting this bad. Asters tried to keep a balance by trying to keep more evil things and events from hurting specific individuals. They had never once been imprisoned by humans, nor had they tried to enslave anyone. No matter the motives of said person. Enslaved pastas, enslaved asters, she repeated back in surprise. What are they trying to bring back to aid them? Her father seemed hesitant to answer this question, to start at least. When she began to open her mouth, her father finally spoke. "I do believe you've heard of Ryzoth." A pulse of heat filled the area as her eye twitched. "Nova?" her father asked with confusion, despite her seeming to be surrounded by a minor blue glow. "Yes," she hissed, feeling an unadulterated rage that caused her tirade 2 years ago. "A primordial demon who was destroyed in an ancient war. It loves fear, blood, and destruction above all else, and yet people still try to play with things they hardly understand." Her voice shook with insanity and rage. Her father took a step back in shock. His daughter was claimed to be a monster on the day she broke. Only now could he actually believe it. The anger began to subside when she took note of his fear. And a weirdly calm smile crossed her lips. "Forgive me. My only memories of this thing come from Willow's murderer," she said, in a horrifyingly even tone. "So you know something about the demon Ryzoth, then?" Her father swallowed dryly. "Then you know if they succeed, things will end ahead of their time, and with more pastas being captured, there won't be enough strength to prevent his destruction." Nova was suddenly brought back into the moment again. She blinked, still containing her anger from the prior revelation. "Strength to be... Excuse me, what?" she asked. Her father looked at her. "Yes, there is a strange agreement between asters and pastas, as our roles often do mean we run into each other. Pastas aren't to kill us, and we will be asked to aid in certain events. Though, with new members of their ranks, I'm not entirely sure who remembers that agreement." "So outside of Ryzoth, the hunters in this agreement, what does this favor have to do with me?" Nova asked. "I know this should be obvious. That said, I can't read your mind, and I don't want to." Her father chuckled lightly, seeming to become less frightened of this situation now that she seemed more stable. "These concerns and the fact that our kind gets caught up in being trapped by these hunters means that we need someone who can look into it from the perspective of your kind. We need someone who can rally those who aren't being controlled and someone to warn them, and hopefully prevent the destruction of everything." She watched her father as he began to trail off under her gaze. It surprised her that the great Aster race needed an exiled member to aid them. What was more annoying than surprising was the fact that she needed to play emissary and soldier all at once. That this might finally bring her some form of closure involving Willow made her feel like her head was spinning. "Can I have some time to mull it over?" she said in defeat, as she felt like she couldn't just say no. Her father nodded. "You'll have to make a decision quickly, though. Say a week, maybe even less than that. I'll return then." She nodded, watching the gentle glow that emanated from him fade away. After he left, she felt annoyed. He always did put her coat first, she grumbled swiftly, pushing off the tree to head home. She pulled the mask back over her face as she marched home in frustration. She wondered why she should even bother. People died all the time, demons were summoned, and she often still killed, making her not much better. That said, he definitely seemed to have changed for the better. He didn't even demand that this is for his sanity, she'd said, approaching the abandoned house. He didn't even say I was a failure. She thought about these changes as her hand hovered over the doorknob. She shook her head in minor agitation, slamming the door behind her in the process. She chucked her mask and hoodie into the chair before going up the stairs to sleep off the anger from Halloween night. Hunters of Ryzoth, Prologue Part 2, Blood Nova. Once my head hit the pillow, sleep was almost instantaneous. I couldn't tell you how long I was awake for before passing out, but seeing as it was rare, it resonated with me. I was often hyped, even ecstatic after a kill or two during the night, so thinking about those things often led to memories of Willow's lifeless body. This time, no success on the victim count, when it would have been the easiest. And with all this new info had left me tired, too tired and frustrated. When I passed out, it felt as though I had woke up somewhere else, living a story through someone else's eyes. And I just couldn't change it. That said, if I could change this story, I would. A young girl woke up late at night. She knew if her dad were to see or hear her now, that she would get another slap to the face. She didn't understand why Papa hit her all the time, but she could only guess that he wanted what was best for her. That was why Mama had to die, according to him. Tonight felt different, like something new and exciting was about to begin. So despite not wanting to get another beating, she quietly stalked down the stairs, being careful to make as little noise as possible. As she stalked over to the back door of her house through the kitchen, she saw a star fly by. The girl quickly crossed her fingers and tightly closed her eyes. "Please, Star, keep Papa asleep. And bring me a friend. I've never been allowed to have one." As she finished those words, she stood on her tiptoes to reach the doorknob and opened the door. She immediately began to shake. It was too cool outside, and she hadn't grabbed a jacket to avoid making too much noise. The girl's teeth began to chatter as the wind whistled through the trees, and the girl took her first steps off of the porch. The woods scared her. Every branch looked like an arm reaching out to grab her, and there was no guarantee that her papa wasn't hidden within the trees or in the shadows. As her breath began to sound more shaky, she took another step in front of her, causing a branch to snap. The girl immediately jumped, looking in every direction before she heard a kind voice behind her. "Are you okay?" The girl jumped once more and paused when she saw a young woman glowing behind her. The girl couldn't find the words to say. She just stood there, continuing to shake. "You look like you're freezing, kiddo," the woman said, now kneeling down to her level. The girl took an opportunity to study the lady's soft blue eyes and gentle-looking features. "An angel?" When the words left her mouth, she jumped, feeling a rush of heat fill her face. The young woman giggled a little, making the girl feel a little more at ease. "Well, I wouldn't call myself an angel. They would be more discreet," the woman said, seeming to try to make as much sense as possible. "I'm called an Esther. I was asked to look after someone." The girl giggled, already feeling like she could trust the woman in front of her. "Hello, Miss Esther," she cheered, bouncing on her heels. "I'm named Willow." The young woman chuckled, looking like she just enjoyed the little girl bounce around her. "Nice to meet you too, Willow," the woman said sweetly, brushing back a lock of blonde hair. "My name's actually Celeste. I was sent to look after you and help you where I can." Willow's eyes widened and began to sparkle. Really? She asked excitedly. Celeste nodded. You're really important, Willow, but there is one rule. You aren't to tell anyone about me. People might try to hurt you because of it, especially if the wrong person found out. Willow seemed to nod. What was keeping this woman from her papa? He had secrets he wouldn't tell her, when his friends were over. You've got it, Miss Celeste. I've got a question, though, she asked, causing Celeste to cock her head inquisitively. Yes, Willow? Celeste asked, her mind reeling due to her father's constant warnings about fulfilling her mission without mistakes. Could you maybe be my friend? Papa says people are dangerous, but you seem okay, and I don't really have any friends, so... Willow seemed to talk more quietly, like she had been yelled at for asking questions, both good and bad. Celeste took note of this behavior, making sure not to ask about it unless she knew her better. Upon reviewing her question mentally, Celeste could feel a twinge of pain when hearing this sweet young girl didn't have any friends. The longer she stayed silent, the more sad Willow got. Celeste suddenly began to freak, as she viewed this as bad for more reasons than one. Suddenly, Willow was hastily pulled into a loving embrace. Sorry for not answering, Willow. Of course, I'd love to be friends. Please tell me if you need anything. Just call my name. Willow giggled at Celeste's flustered response. It's okay, Miss Celeste, Willow said in a chipper tone after being released from the hug. I would have understood if you'd said no. Celeste shook her head. I wouldn't say no to things I can do. Plus, I find it hard to believe that no one wants to be friends, so I promise I mean it, Willow. Willow beamed before cheering and giggling. Okay, she said with joy. She seemed to bounce around due to joy alone. I'm glad I went out here. Willow paused, looking at the area they were in. She knew she went still with fear. Oh no. If I don't get back home before Papa wakes up, I don't know where Willow began to panic. Her face went pale, revealing any bruises that were beginning to form from earlier. Whoa, 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 Celeste said in a comforting tone. I can get you home without your dad knowing. Just relax. Celeste was carefully holding her shoulders when Willow began to panic again. Celeste got her to calm down. She even began to sing a lullaby to the young girl, causing her to fall asleep. The next morning, when Willow woke up, she was in her room with a note next to her pillow. She quickly snatched up the note and read it. I told you I could get you home. Friend, I hope you got to sleep well. See you soon. Again soon. Celeste the Aster. Willow giggled, quickly hiding the note under her pillow when she heard her father marching up the stairs. Willow! Her father yelled, Why haven't you come down to do chores? Willow shook with fear. Before looking at the time, it was only 2 minutes past her time to get up, and yet it was still too long. I'm sorry, Papa, she said, trying not to cry once she responded. Her father slammed the door open, furiously stomping over to her bed. You're lucky I'm in a good mood today, he snarled, whilst getting into her face. Her father reeked of alcohol and looked like a disgusting mess. Now clean the bathroom, the kitchen, and my room. That way I can enjoy my day in peace. Yes, Papa, Willow stuttered as she quickly and carefully slid past him to get started. Despite his comments on being in a good mood, Willow still figured that either she wasn't getting any food today, wasn't going to school, or a beating would come after she completed her work. Either way, her father was strict. He wanted her to be prepared for the future. That said, interacting with Celeste, she wasn't so sure anymore. You can forget about school or breakfast, her father yelled from across the house. Willow wanted to cry desperately, but she knew it would only make things worse. After the nice night she had, she couldn't contain her tears this time, though. So she cried. As she worked throughout the day, she hadn't noticed a set of eyes following her, discreetly from outside. So between beatings and unwarranted punishments, someone was watching. After the day was over, she could tell her father was asleep. So she said, Miss Celeste, are you there? As she asked this, the young woman tapped on her window, causing Willow to jump. She stifled her giggling, carefully placing her steps before opening the window. "Sorry, I'd meet you outside, but Papa only just got to sleep," she muttered, letting Celeste inside. "It's okay, Willow. But are you okay?" Celeste asked, looking at her bloodied face, sadness diminishing her natural glow. Willow nodded, but she knew she couldn't really hide the injuries, so she said, "I just tripped at school." Celeste didn't press her, despite seeing how the whole day had played out. "Okay," she said, trying to sound like she had just bought the lie. "Do you want me to clean you up and fix the wounds a little?" Willow had wanted to say no, but she didn't. She couldn't do that to her new friend, despite the lie from before. As she cleaned her wounds and applied bandages, Willow's stomach growled and Willow blushed deeply. But Celeste gave a soft laugh in return. "You skipped lunch today, didn't you?" Willow nodded in agreement before Celeste added, "Give me a second, Willow. I just need to finish this." Willow giggled in return. "Okay, Miss Celeste." Celeste finished fixing her up as best she could before reaching behind her. Willow looked at her in confusion, wondering what she could be doing if the Star Woman didn't have a bag. Just as she was about to ask, Celeste turned back around, holding a peanut butter and jelly sandwich in front of her. "There you go, Willow. This should help." Willow looked at the food in awe, only to ask, "Are you sure I can have this? I mean, it's yours, right?" Celeste shook her head. "Nope. I made this for you, sweetie. So please, eat up." Willow thanked her repeatedly, nearly crying as she did so. When she took her first bite, she hummed blissfully. She was so thankful, especially since this meant that her dad was wrong about friends. "Willow, I hope you don't mind me asking, but how old are you?" Celeste asked kindly. Willow blinked, looking back at the food briefly. "I'm 4, she said, "but Papa doesn't like when people ask me that." Celeste faked embarrassment, an embarrassed blush, and said, "I'm sorry, your Papa must be very overprotective." Willow nodded and went back to eating. The pair of them sat in an awkward silence for a while before Willow asked, "Papa says after school I need to do his chores too, since work has him busy. Could you help me?" Celeste nodded, giving her the kindest smile, and said, We can even make games out of it." Willow smiled, giggling a little as she crawled into bed. Then she asked one final request to Celeste. "Could you stay with me and sing me to sleep?" Celeste nodded. She quietly sung her to sleep before leaving. The next day, weeks, months, and even a year went by, with few problems between them, as Celeste was completing her task of protecting Willow, eventually to the point where Willow trusted her enough with her father's darker side. It was December by that point, and Willow called out for Celeste a week before her birthday. "Oh my! What happened?" Celeste whispered sharply, seeing the young girl cry and sob. Willow wouldn't stop crying, so Celeste did the only thing she could think in the moment. She hugged her close and sang to soothe her. As she sang, 2 thoughts crossed her mind. The fact that her father told her to do other things throughout the day, and that Willow's father had clearly gotten worse. "For a man who wants me to succeed," she thought, while soothing Willow, "he sure can't have me abandoning rules to protect Willow, can he?" As she finished the song, Celeste wondered if it even mattered, but she couldn't bring herself to leave Willow to that monster of a father either. "Miss Celeste," Willow called, finally breathing enough to address her. "Willow, what's wrong?" Celeste asked, worried about how she might hear as she placed worried about what she might hear as she placed a warm feeling gem in her hand. Willow almost began to cry again when she said, "I'm sorry. Friends aren't supposed to lie. But I didn't tell you about Papa at all." Celeste shook her head. "No, none of that. I'm okay. You weren't trying to hurt me. So please, tell me what's wrong." Willow tried to swallow the knot in her throat before she said, Papa has always been odd. It started with small things, like yelling at and hitting Mama. But then one night, he stood over her, blood covered in blood. When I asked him about it, he said Mama was planning to hurt us, so she had to die. I'm not sure about that anymore, because a little bit after he killed Mama, we moved. He began making me do all the work around the house. He said something about preparing me for my 5th birthday. It doesn't matter what I do, though. He yells at me for mistakes. Doesn't let me leave without him, and hits or stars me if I'm late or talk back. Tonight, Papa found out about your note, and he... Willow trailed off, the gravity of the situation hitting Celeste like a ton of bricks. For the first time ever, she wanted others involved hurt, her own father included. She couldn't keep bowing the knee to her father's rules, because she wasn't sure if it would get Willow killed. Then she would come home having failed, and she didn't want to fail. If not because of her father, then because of Willow herself. Celeste's light dimmed so much that she almost looked like a normal person. Her eyes seemed to flicker between soft blue and swirling red-orange, and her hair nearly darkened. Miss Celeste, what do I do? What do we do? Willow asked, noticing the change in Celeste almost instantly. Celeste shook off her anger, just as an idea entered her mind. Your birthday's next week on the 15th, right? Celeste asked, feeling rather clever. Willow nodded, confused. A confused look crossed her face. Yeah, but why? Celeste smiled, then said, Because for your birthday, I'm getting you out of here. Willow smiled, and then looked at the young Aster inquisitively. How? Papa says he's gonna stay with me all day. Celeste smiled calmly, almost understanding the 4-year-old's concern. Make sure you have your stuff packed. And try to sneak out the back door when your father's distracted. He'll have his friends over again that day, right? Willow's eyes sparkled, finally understanding her plan. So then I can call your name and we can run far away. Celeste nodded, shushing her as a reminder that her father was still asleep. Willow covered her mouth fearfully but nodded. Now then, why don't we play a quick board game and get you some good sleep? Celeste said, looking at the little girl who was now fully healed. Willow nodded. They spent a couple hours playing Candyland before Willow went to sleep. The two of them failed to realize that was one of the last moments of fun they would ever have. After a week of Willow's usual routine of trying to live day to day and talking with Celeste when her father wasn't home, her birthday came. Willow was now 5 years old. She was going to be free. However, things felt incredibly strange when she woke up. She half wondered if it was just nerves, but then she looked at her clock. She should have been up an hour ago, but her papa was nowhere in sight, so she ran downstairs to start her chores, but her father had already done them. Hello, sweetie, her father said, making her feel uneasy. I'm sorry I've been so hard on you, but I want you to know your father is getting help. Willow didn't understand. She didn't feel sure. Her father's smile seemed genuine. Okay, she said, confused, but not sure if she should back out of the plans with Celeste or not. Her father plopped down a plate of fluffy pancakes in front of her, and she ate, not wanting him to get mad. The two of them were going through a normal day, with her even going to school being wished a good day. This felt too good to be true, but it felt wrong, too. People don't change overnight, right? Willow almost wondered if her father was playing nice so she wouldn't leave. As the school day ended, Willow pulled this resolve together to leave as planned with Miss Celeste. As she got in the car to go home, she answered her papa whenever he asked her a question. She wanted to make him think he'd won her over. When they got home, she said, I'm going to do my homework, Papa. Okay, sweet pea. he called back, so she packed her bag. As soon as her dad's friends showed up, she snuck out the back door with her stuff and made a break for it. She didn't get very far when her father's guttural screams pierced through the woods behind their house. In a matter of seconds, Willow began darting through the woods, adrenaline making her body feel like ice. Her feet began to carry her farther faster when she heard her dad running behind her. He screamed obscenities as he did, causing her heart to race. She was about to call out for Celeste when a sharp pain filled her head. The world briefly went dark after what felt like seconds. Her father stood over her. Willow was gripped with fear as she tried to cry out for Celeste again. Her father plunged a knife into her shoulder and she screamed out in agony. Her heart raced as she tried to slide away from her father. You'll be Ryzoth's vessel. You should be excited. Her father rasped out, plunging the knife into her right leg. Despite the pain, Willow was finally able to mutter in panic, Celeste, please hurry. Her father scowled before an insane grin replaced his frustrated expression. Your friend can't save you now. He cackled, plunging her with the knife. In a matter of seconds, before she could scream for help, her father repeatedly plunged the knife into her body, his laugh drowning out any prior peace in the area. The world began to fade from her vision while she gargled out Celeste's name one more time. Once her father left, she was unable to take notice, only hearing someone call her name and feeling her body move. Willow! Oh God! I can do something! Please stay awake! Called Celeste's voice. Willow's eyes opened, seeing Celeste panic, trying to stop the bleeding. Miss Celeste! She coughed. Celeste tried to shush her, as a futile effort to try to keep her alive. Willow still continued. I know you want to save me, but I think it's too late. Please just don't let Papa do this to anyone else. Despite saying that unbroken, she fell back into a fit of coughing before the world went dark for the last time. After her life faded, Celeste faded too. Her glowing dissipated to nothing. Her hair turned to a dark brown and her eyes became a swirling black, orange, and red. She cried loud pain sobs that cut through the air. She couldn't think. Her heart felt like it was full of needles as sadness and anger cut into her like a knife. When a man entered the area with a group of people behind him, all of them wore demon masks to cover their faces. The man who led their ranks growled, Who are you? Why is my daughter the vessel being hugged by some strange woman? Put Ryzoth's vessel down. Suddenly, Celeste stopped crying, feeling something inside of her burst. She slowly let go of Willow and stood up. Excuse me, she said, her voice shaking. Ryzoth? Is that what this is about? A demon who would kill you without a second thought? The man approached her, spinning the blood-soaked knife. Martha didn't understand. Willow wouldn't have either. His sweet release of death is a blessing to this weak world. Willow needed to be tough enough to handle that change, and Celeste began to laugh maniacally. Her shoulders shook harshly as a loud bellowing laugh escaped her lips. It paused the man's monologue, as heat seemed to fill the immediate area. Willow was your toy! Well, you played with forces you don't understand and can't control! Celeste said through her maniacal laughter. With the failure to save Willow from her father, and her father standing right in front of her, the heat formed into bright blue heated claws on her fingers. The group in front of her began to back away as she advanced. She laughed, crying at the same time. Most of their deaths were blanked out in her mind, though she could remember the squeals of pain and the sickening cracks and pops that came with her from Willow's father. The others were about the same. As they ran, she would attack them with brutality she didn't even know she had. Sizzling sounds intermingled with crunches and screams. Each sound filled her with an extreme amount of joy. When she reached the last person, her purple dress was covered in bloodstains. Her skin was covered in blood. Any kindness and cuteness she had held before was gone, and the last man standing looked horrified. He was trying to keep from vomiting as he stared at the massacre that took place in front of him. "Monster!" the man suddenly cried out as she drew even closer. She paused, pretending she felt embarrassed before laughing a little. "That's rich, coming from you. You could have done something so many times, but you didn't. So if I'm the monster, then you are, too." She held up her hand, ready to shred him like she had the rest. When she looked at his expression, aside from fear, he looked like her words had meant something to him. A slight grin crossed her face as she bent down to him. Her face splattered with blood, her eyes seeming to glow all together with a smile that only a sadist could have. The man looked as though he was going to faint when she whispered in his ear, only having to move slightly to do so. "If you can do something next time, do something, anything. Avoid running into another supernova of blood. You won't get off this easy next time." She walked away, feeling her powers taken from her as she lost all connection with the home of the Asters. She shredded her outfit, stealing a black hoodie from one of the bodies as well as the black pants and a red shirt. She stole a pair of boots off of another body. They were brown and red bloodstains. She had walked away from the scene, feeling a familiar stare, but knowing it was the last glance at her for her actions before the feeling faded. She disappeared into the woods. Hunters of Ryzoth, Chapter 1. A Tenuous Agreement. "That journal was enough to help me make a decision!" Nova cried, swinging her claws into the heart of a hunter who had just tried to trap her. "And reliving that night over and over, and I'm not any closer!" Nova listened to the man's gargled breaths as blood bubbled from his mouth and poured from his torso. She was just thankful that he was an easy mark, as her mind just wasn't with it. Even his typical MO outside of being a hunter had been overly consistent. One could even call him completely predictable. "You were even there the night I collected this," Nova added, pulling old leather-bound journal from her pocket. "But you were too focused on your shitty hobbies outside of saving humanity to actually give me anything useful, let alone know how to use the tools they gave you and be of any use to them." "Bitch," the guy coughed, crimson spilling onto his chin. "You're still alive?" she asked, a sadistic smile creeping across her face. "You're really still alive?" Nova could see the man shake, his adrenaline barely keeping him alive. A soft, creepy laugh could be heard underneath her mask. Once she stopped, she noticed his eyes were beginning to gloss over and the light was fading from them. "I know you won't be able to answer these questions, buddy, but before you fade away, did you think your sins would go unpunished? Better yet, was this life you had valuable?" She watched as his eyes turned to glass and sighed with an odd sense of glee. She looked closely at the journal she'd managed to nab. The binding was worn, no doubt from Willow's father scratching at the binding while trying to remember what he was going to write down. The man had been dead for 2 years, but somehow his plans to resurrect Ryzoth hadn't died with him. She shook with anger, feeling frustrated that she couldn't decipher most of this journal when it came to the ritual. She briefly glared daggers at the journal before placing it back in the hoodie's pocket. "Well," she said annoyedly, spitting on her heel to head home. "It looks like week 2-1. Nova progressing on point A, 0. As she was about to pull her mask up to breathe in the cool night air, she heard some oddly loud sounds. Some sounding like distorted animal cries, while others, or at least one, sounded like a person's dying screams. She looked at the direction of the sounds, her heart pounding with an odd mixture of dread and joy. And yet, what was that? And what was that? She asked. She sighed, a slight shake to her voice. She rubbed her temples in annoyance as the anger started to build. "If I don't check it, though," she grumbled, her body beginning to move towards the screams, "I may just regret it." She turned her head back towards her handiwork, a ruby puddle underneath the man, his face as still as a doll, and had glossed over eyes to complete the look. "Well, buddy, if your friends are still over there, they'll be joining you soon." A more subtle smile crossed her lips as she turned away. She began to tear through the woods, her feet snapping twigs and leaves in her wake. As she drew closer to the sound she heard, she made more reserved movements. She nearly silenced her footsteps and managed to gain control of her breathing as she hid behind a tree on the edge of the large clearing. Upon peeking around it, she saw a kid with no arms or legs, surrounded by what she assumed were Pokemon. They all looked like letters, each one of them with an eye at their center, along with 2 Eevees of sorts, among other Pokemon that appeared to be twisted or demonic in some way. The boy towards the back of the group called out. The Pokemon around him just looking as stressed as he did. "Hee! You psychic!" he called, the death-like screams she had heard before following his voice. Nova's eyes were quickly drawn to a snarky voice with demonic undertones. "I'm trying, Silver, but I'm not getting the opportunity to, so wait!" She studied the Eevee closely. It had green ears with green tufts of fur sticking out of them, as well as a green split tail. In the center of its head was a red gem, and its fur was nearly white otherwise. Its eyes held black sclera and red irises. "Okay, so that's it," she thought, now being able to put visuals to things she had read after changing. She didn't have much time to be in awe of those who were able to keep track of individuals in this world, as she was shaken from her thoughts by the sound of a thud. "Eee!" cried another Eevee sadly in the group, as the other group drew ever closer. She didn't have time to think. She could see the Pokepasta getting more and more bloodied. Even the unknowns were getting in on the fight, only to be pushed back by the demons and other serial killers on the other side. The idea that entered her mind was only loosely based. But instead of planning it all out, she just implemented it. "Oi!" she yelled so she could be heard, "Over here!" After those words left her mouth, everyone turned to her. She made claws that she had when killing the man who she had left behind. She studied the group of mind-controlled pastas as the other group had taken towards the area behind them. She couldn't quite see what was controlling them yet, as it was dark. Even the glow emanating from her claws wasn't giving her much to work with. She did notice the lack of expression from them until they started charging from her. Laughter exploded from Jeff's mouth. Mask and Hoodie charged forward, among others she didn't have time to recognize. "Shit, shit, shit!" she muttered, pulling herself out of a daze, running back the way she came. As she took off, however, she didn't notice the boy coming back. "Why does that masked idiot matter anyway?" he growled. "Silver, we should just leave," said another more saddened but calmer voice. Silver turned his head back. His expression seemed to be almost exasperated. "I know we don't all get along out there," he retorted, turning his torso around to face the other 2 Eevees. "But I can't help it. She seemed like a new face. I don't know why she helped us, but if those guys kill her, the hunters might use that to their advantage. Besides, we wouldn't even have teamed up if this crap wasn't already going on. You want to die or become a pawn, that's on you. Come on, Lonely, Hee argued, beginning to leave the two of them behind. I can't. Loneliness finally spoke, having Hee only taken a couple steps away from them. Hee whipped back around, an angered look crossing his face. Are you stupid too, Lonely? Hee snarled at the two of them. The blood dripping from his face almost seemed to thicken. It was Loneliness's turn to snarl, looking like he did when he died on the end of his story. Hee jumped at the sudden change to the otherwise sad and yet normal-looking Eevee. I'm not stupid, Loneliness stomped towards him. I just don't want to abandon her. A few seconds of the group staring at each other. Silver and Loneliness followed the girl, while a few unknown and Hee stayed behind briefly. Hee tried to continue with his plan to leave, but found he couldn't anymore. He growled, looking at the few unknown who had stayed with him. Silver wanted you to stay with me, huh? Hee asked, only to get their typical cries as confirmation. Hee growled, agitated, but then barked an order to them. Lead me to your idiot trainer. Please. The unknown seemed to chime with a glee of sorts, leading the annoyed Eevee in the direction of the others. Meanwhile, a ways away from the Pokepastas, Nova was still running. She had gone a bit past the area where she had killed one of the hunters. Her heart pounded at her chest as she broke into the clearing. She skidded to a halt. Okay, she said, taking a quick look at the clearing. This should be far enough. She turned around, taking deep breaths, trying to regain some level of focus so she could fight back. As she did, she took a couple of steps back, just to give herself some room to react. The mind-controlled group attacked her from every angle. Their movements were methodical, almost like their natural instincts were limited. Nova had long since planned not to kill any of them, thus her claws weren't visible anymore. She was keeping the plasma she could produce close while she was fighting, though she could see the method being used on the captured pastas. There were collars on each of their necks, each with a different symbol in the middle. She figured this was to distinguish who had control over who. When she felt the circle of them closing in on her, she landed a harsh kick to the pasta in front of her. It was Jeff. At least this time it was. His non-blinking eyes seemed to fill with rage, but he just stood up in the same methodical way as he and the others were fighting. Figuring she had bought enough time, knowing full well she wasn't going to escape this alive if she fought fair, she resolved to fake death, even though a part of her wanted to rip them apart. Her agreement with her father rang in her mind. It was the one thing keeping her from putting them out of their misery. Okay, she muttered, pretending to feel weak and tired from the fight already. She took a few hits, begrudgingly, while planning her demise carefully. She would punch back, block blows, and seeming to orchestrate the battle so when they killed her, it wouldn't result in her actual death. It was then when she decided that she would let Jeff stab her. It made the most sense as she had been careful to block most lethal punches and kicks. Hoodie hadn't even pulled out his gun once, like normal. So, with her final decision in place, she let herself be tripped and pushed herself back. Another blow dealt to her face, making her grateful she hadn't removed her mask. The mask cracked, chipping away from her face. She could see her eye reflecting in the eyes of Jeff as he pushed away the others harshly. She decided to give the suppressed killer's mind some joy. She forced her face to emulate fear so it could be seen by him. As she noticed the joy enter his eyes, she watched the knife swing down, acting like she didn't have time to act. Although half expected the knife to enter her heart, it snapped its way through her shoulder. She yelped in surprise, feeling the pain rip through her. She could feel the urge to burn him with her plasma claws, but the agreement pushed her to resume her current plan. He yanked the knife from her shoulder, and another burst of pain filled her body, causing her to groan. Jeff repeatedly missed deadly blows, probably from whoever had mind control over him. When she noticed he had dealt enough damage for her death to be convincing, that the first blow couldn't have killed her. She allowed the blood to flow from her mouth and began to stop breathing altogether. She made her heart slow to a stop. She could feel her body surrounded by the same natural cool that she always felt at home. She could hear Jeff laugh loudly, but it stopped when he was told to leave by the others. While they were focused on her, she used a small amount of power and focused on it. She could see the area within a mile-wide radius. While she was doing this, she couldn't help but think, "Hurry up and leave, you effing idiots." While she watched them from the view of the stars, Jeff looked back a couple of times, his mind swimming in rage over the fact that he wasn't able to act on his own free will. There were a few times where those hunters' control over them would briefly slip, allowing them to lie or do something of their own volition. It wasn't enough for him, but the more he fought, the more pain he felt. He even saw her start to stir a little when the group started to leave. He knew they were returning to the hunters to lead them back to her body. He took a breath, planning to lie about killing her anyway, while hoping she would be gone by the time they got back. When they had left, loneliness had run towards what seemed to be Nova's lifeless body. "No!" Loneliness cried, beginning to get depressed. Silver barely caught up with half his unknown surrounding him. His eyes widened, seeing Loneliness nudging her arm. "Lonely, she's gone," Silver said, understanding Loneliness's sadness. He created shadowy phantom limbs and used them to kneel down to Loneliness's level. He stroked the sad Eevee, feeling a bit sad too. As E caught up, he saw the scene but bit his tongue. He could tease them, but he knew that they had wanted to help her if they could. "You were right," Silver said numbly. "Are you happy now?" He stalked over, his tail switching in annoyance. "No, because I came out here so you guys wouldn't die, and now you may as well be." Silver gave a slight smile to E, and so did Lonely. As Silver got up, getting ready to leave, E let out a growl. "What's wrong?" Loneliness asked, trying to keep the two of them from fighting. "Look for yourself," he growled, getting Silver and Lonely to turn around. When they did, they saw the girl had sat up. Her mask was now off of her face, and she was trying to stand. Silver stood offensively with his phantom limbs, and with his unknown surrounding him. E and Loneliness stood in front of them, haunches raised. When Nova finally raised her head, her mouth was still surrounded by her own blood, but her injuries were seeming to disappear with foggy beams of silver. She stared at the group, her eyes widening as she realized she hadn't just been seeing things. "What are you guys doing here?" she asked, thoroughly confusing them. "You should have left. I was buying you time to get out of there." He was the one to break the brief staring contest, as Nova's black hole eyes gave off their ember-like glow. "Why would you help any of us?" he almost snarled. Aren't you supposed to be dead?" Silver would have scolded him, were he not in shock. Nova's eyes twitched as she looked like she wanted to facepalm. Loneliness walked over to sniff her. E tried to stop him, but Lonely finally spoke. "We're sorry. We just wanted to understand and try to help you." E and Silver expected the worst and were already getting ready to avenge him. However, Nova pet him and sighed before replying. "Hunters were controlling them. I just wanted to help. Those idiots are trying to revive something they shouldn't, and I know they would have killed you." The group started to form questions for her. However, they heard the group coming back. "Shit!" Nova muttered before scooping up Loneliness in one arm and grabbing Silver's phantom arms with the opposite hand. E trailed behind them, with Silver finally finding his voice in the middle of the situation. Where are we going? My place. It's not far. Plus, it looks pretty inconspicuous to most, Nova answered bluntly, her gaze staying firmly in front of her. She could tell that she might have a few questions coming her way, but it wasn't like she wasn't helping like she couldn't while helping them lay low. After hitting the main trail leading back to her house, it was just a quick sprint to her front door. She let go of Silver a little before the front door steps to her house. She pulled out her keys, unlocking the door quickly and ushering E and Silver inside. She gently sent Loveliness down before closing the door and locking it. She left the lights off and led the group to the back of the house. They all stayed unnervingly silent for a long time while the hunters searched the area around the house. While they searched the area, all parties involved felt a tension that they didn't normally feel. As the hunters started to fight about what to do next and then eventually left, all of them could feel the tension fade. So those guys have been absconding with other pastas, E said, breaking the silence. But what are they getting out of it, and how do you know so much about their plans? Everyone turned to Nova. She just sighed. It'll be easier if I just start from the beginning. Hopefully I answer all your questions that way. They all nodded and listened carefully as she explained her story and what her father had told her 2 weeks ago. Okay, Silver said, sighing. So you're what's called an Aster, and your job is to keep balance like an angel. And your father, who was part of what drove you crazy, came to you and told you all this stuff. That's the gist of it, yeah, Nova said, almost laughing. E then added, and so now you have to be an emissary and try to stop hunters before they take all of us, or stop them from summoning Ryzoth the demon. I'm assuming preferably both, Loneliness added. Nova nodded. The three of them plus the unknowns seemed to feel the weight on Nova's shoulders. They briefly excused themselves to discuss their next steps, leaving Lona to lose herself in thought. So what are we thinking? Silver asked his unknowns at E and Loneliness. This actually sounds like it's pretty important, Loneliness started off. E sighed, sounding a bit annoyed. She's not going to get very far, and none of us want to die. But we can't be the only ones helping her either, Silver said calmly. If we are planning on helping her. The unknowns gave a cry in agreement. That said, E said, sounding a bit annoyed by this prospect, how do we help outside of the obvious fighting? Getting in contact with operators is difficult at best and dangerous at worst, Loneliness said. We'd be better off getting her into contact with people who are connected to it. Regardless, Silver said, now feeling a bit annoyed himself, we can all agree we're going to be in this for the long haul. They were all still talking for a long time before they came back to tell her they were in. Hunters of Ryzoth, Chapter 2. Trust isn't given, it's earned. The next morning came almost too quickly, as demonic espion cries filled the house. Silver shot up, awakened by the loud noises, but more so annoyed that he had been woken up at all. He forced himself out of the dusty bed he had been allowed to use last night, and he marched himself out into the hallway to see an angry E sharpening his claws on the hardwood floor, before crying out in anger again. E, Silver tried to talk to him, only to be ignored. Silver grit his teeth upon hearing the same cry that woke him up echoing in his ears once more. But before he could yell at him, he felt a tugging on his ripped shorts. The unknown closest to his head at the time cried calmly to get him to look down. Loneliness was right next to what used to be his leg, and he heaved a sigh. His phantom limbs appeared once more as he knelt down for the sad-looking Evie. Okay, so what's going on? Silver asked tiredly. reaching his newly formed hand up to rub the bridge of his nose. "She's not here," Loneliness stated in a matter-of-factly tone, laced with concern. "She wasn't here when we both woke up about 6 hours ago, and she isn't back now." Silver blinked in shock as E stalked his way over to join their conversation. "For all we know, she was working with them to capture us." E switched his tail in front of his paws as he sat down. "So pardon me for not being the conversation type." Silver gave him a slight glare as if to tell him to stop. E huffed, looking away in anger. "Okay," Silver sighed, agitation now geared towards Nova. "We need to prepare for the worst. I'll keep an eye out for her and any hunters. You guys grab the stuff so we can leave. And prepare for a potential fight, too." Both Eevees nodded before taking off in 2 separate directions in the house. Silver sent some of his unknowns to stay with them and help, before heading towards the door to keep watch. He silently watched the front door, nearest to the window, through the nearest window. He silently watched the front door that they had entered through the nearest window, watching for any dangers so he could warn the other 2. 2 minutes had passed, and then 3, when he saw Nova coming back. What surprised, and even bothered him more, was that she had tons of bags in her hand. Some bags were made of burlap, while others looked like plain plastic. He marched towards the door in anger, allowing E and Loneliness to hear. As she opened the door, Silver stood a foot back from the door, giving her a cross look. Before he could even speak, E growled out, "Where the fuck were you, hey, traitor?" Nova paused. Now in the middle of pulling the bags inside, confusion plagued her mind. From the moment she had entered the door, she had wondered why Silver was watching and now glaring at her. With part of their stance made clear by E, she wondered what she had done wrong. "I'm sorry, what?" she asked, letting go of the bag that she had been pulling in when the question had been asked. "You heard me!" E doubled down, almost emanating a cry as he did so. Silver jumped in at this point, with a similar tone, his voice filling with whispers. "Where were you, ratting us out to the hunters?" Loneliness only had his back to her, making the Aster very agitated. "I just went out shopping," she said, her voice being numb and even as she responded to them. "I woke up this morning and checked the fridge. When I did, I noticed I didn't have much in terms of food, so I left to get some." She could barely keep herself from snapping at the group when Lonely chimed in, turning around as he did so. "You were gone for 6 hours! Shopping doesn't take that long!" She nearly facepalmed when Silver began to speak again. "We just met you. Do you expect us to believe that? You know, if I'm about to get the whole trust is earned, it's not given spiel, I'm aware!" she snapped, cutting the boys off in the middle of his rant. "I didn't want to wake you guys up because we all had a long night. For 1. For 2, the place I went to is not only far from the house, but because I don't always have money to give, I'm able to pay for the stuff I get by doing them favors. And 3, if I'm a traitor selling you out to the hunters, you'd think I'd be smart enough not to give myself away this quickly, wouldn't you?" Silence cut through the air almost instantly after those words left her mouth. Not because there was a sudden trust between them, but because there wasn't. They all stood in a strange staring contest, with no one changing course for several minutes. Nova had finally calmed down enough to quickly scoop up the rest of the bags and place them in the kitchen. She began putting stuff away herself, occasionally feeling for the bottle of bone dust in the front pocket of her hoodie that she had brought with her when she left. Not 2 seconds after she started, did the others join her in the kitchen. Probably to make sure she hadn't purchased poison of some sort. She wanted to gripe and whine about this. But a part of her knew, or at least expected, that she might be confronted by them when she got back. Murderers, ghosts, monsters, game characters, as long as you were there to cause fear online, you were a pasta. With that in mind, this also left plenty of room for distrust, as many creepypastas were murderous, not too unlike herself. Lying had never been off the table, so she knew why they were acting like this. But it didn't make it feel any less infuriating. She had placed a few bags to the side as they weren't for the kitchen. She sighed, glad to have everything put away, when Silver, E, and Lonely apologized. Nova only shook her head. You had every right. I should have told you what I was doing. There was once again silence. She knew they only half meant their shared apology. She didn't let it get to her, though, choosing to accept that it was the better option, as she didn't want to cause any unneeded trouble. She stretched, feeling like this situation was just getting worse the longer she was there. She sighed, going up to her room without a word to the others. She could feel them watching her as she walked up the stairs and down the newly scratched up hallway. She heard them begin to talk as she walked past the room she let Silver use, before plopping down on the bed in her room. The room was a soft gray color all around. The wallpaper had been worn by the years as nearly no pattern was left anymore. She started taking deep breaths to calm herself further, so she wasn't as angry. And as she did, she felt sharp pains fill her body. Damn it, she muttered, still feeling pain from being stabbed last night. She then pulled out the bottle of bone dust and studied it for a moment. The bottle was surprisingly intricate, a crystal-like look and colored in a gentle pink. Its cap was a gold-silver color, having detailed engravings work done on the cap to dress it up nicely. The bone dust inside had a milky hue and almost looked like white sand. She cautiously opened the bottle, watching the dust move ever so slightly as the bottle opened. I don't understand, she breathed out in awe. Why you can heal me when I can't heal myself during the day. But I enjoy the sacrifice of whoever this belonged to, nonetheless. She then proceeded to pour the dust into her mouth, crunching it between her teeth and savoring the odd flavor. She knew that she would never return home anyway, so knowing that this would have been taboo or was taboo by human standards didn't bother her anymore. As this took place, Silver, E, and Loneliness were studying the bags that Nova had left out. What's this shit? He asked, looking at the bags left on the counter. Silver shook his head, not sure what to make of it either, only to have Loneliness speak up. We could bring it into her living room and look at it. Not like we're taking off with it, so to speak. Jeez, E replied. I thought I was supposed to be the reckless one, not you. Lonely was about to retort when Silver said, No, we need to make sure she doesn't have anything to stab us in the back with. E, Lonely, and the unknown seemed to understand his sentiment, so he grabbed the 2 bags and laid them on the old coffee table in the living room. They stared at the 2 bags for a minute before Silver opened up one. Inside of the bag was several small blue crystal bottles with a strange liquid inside. When opened, none of them felt threatened by the contents, though they weren't quite sure why, considering the fact that they didn't even know what it was. In the next bag Next in the bag was some sort of book explaining techniques for using electronics and static for fighting, transport, etc. Silver's eyes lit up with excitement at the prospect of being able to do what Ben and even E could do. Loneliness bounced up a little to get Silver's attention. When he looked over, E was giving a look. This stuff teaches how to travel through the electronics that you and Ben do. Silver started looking at, getting a look of awe from Lonely. E stalked over, jumping under the couch behind him to look at the book. Wait, he said, realizing that Silver was telling the truth. Why would she get this? She can't do that. Maybe we were wrong? Loneliness chimed in, jumping under the couch next to Silver. None of them were sure about that quite yet. There were a few more books about similar abilities in that same bag. They studied the books with interest and almost in awe of all the information. But they still didn't know what the other stuff was. Then they opened bag number 2. Inside were knives and different weapons of different kinds. Some even had symbols of different kinds. They figured that each weapon had been made in a specialized way for each of them. Silver was especially drawn to a ball that looked similar to a Pokemon ball. None of them could tell what it was for, but it was interesting to say the least. As they were about to look through the books again, they heard Nova coming back downstairs. They rushed to put things away when they heard her chuckle. You know that stuff is for you guys, right? She asked, her head turned over towards them just past the stairs. None of them replied. She gave them a small sigh before saying, Well, that stuff is indeed for you. I just wanted to make sure you could defend yourselves. Again, silence. But at least they looked like they were letting go of the prior events. She went to go make something to eat for everyone, knowing if she hadn't actually eaten anything, they hadn't either. The rest of the day continued with awkward glances and complete silence between Nova and the Pokepastas. Nova knew things would take time, but she didn't shake the fact that she had a job to complete. The next day. Hey, Silver, we're clear on the plan, right? Loneliness asked, despite not being completely sure about E's plan after they had all gone to bed. You're not sure about it, are ya? Silver asked, almost laughing, despite his exhaustion. I'm not. If she's really a hunter in disguise, then won't we just end up fighting her anyway? She could be like the others, you know. Silver nodded. But if we don't, we won't know for sure either. With that, the group finally went to sleep. The next morning, Silver was awoken by a gentle nudging. Lonely was pawing at his side with a look that told him all that he needed to know. When he left the room, he saw E already waiting for them at the top of the steps. He wasn't growling. He didn't make a sound, only nodding down the stairs as his way of telling them that Nova was about to leave again. Meanwhile, downstairs, Nova was grabbing her hoodie and the broken black hole mask that she had from the other night. She even was grabbing a backpack for some extra essentials. As she popped the mask into her backpack and turned to head towards the door, she saw Silver, E, and the unknowns blocking her way. We're going with you today, Silver said firmly, whether you like it or not. Nova could feel her agitation rise once more, and similar to yesterday's. However, 2 things crossed her mind. 1, she would probably have done the same thing given the circumstance. And 2, having them join her wouldn't actually hinder her during this job. All right, she said in a tired and annoyed voice. That said, we all have a long walk ahead of us. Silver and the others seemed somewhat relieved, but also somewhat worried about this answer. Silver just sighed, thanking her, to which Nova nodded. As they were leaving the house, they ended up being able to see an area surrounding the house. It seemed like they were in the center of a small clearing, with miles of trees rimming the outside of that clearing. They all ended up frozen there for a second, as they had never even thought to really pay attention to the outside since they had been there. "You guys coming, or?" Nova suddenly asked, pulling the group out of their collective daze. She was already at the edge of the clearing on the main trail, and seemed to end at the house. Silver ran over, his unknowns following him closely. Hee and Loneliness followed just behind them. When they finally caught up, Nova cut off any snide remarks from them by turning on her heels to face the path. "I could have just left," she said coolly. "I didn't, though, because I'm not going back on our agreement." The group fell almost silent, with Hee cursing under his breath at her. Eventually his complaints fell silent as they continued down the winding trail. They were in the woods for what felt like an eternity, and the place had a hazy feel to it. Fog coming and going in random intervals, and some diverging paths that others would have taken had Nova not been ignoring them entirely. The trail ended at a street, cutting off the whole thing, with no visible continuation on the other side. Nova paused, looking back and forth at the street before speaking to them again. On the other side is a short stint of additional woodland, and then we'll be in a major town for the next 30 minutes. Make sure you have a hiding spot or a disguise of some sort, as people don't like things they don't understand. "Sure thing," Silver said, already semi-prepared from being taught once a long time ago. Hee seemed to tisk in annoyance, planning to hide in Silver's hoodie once they got there. It was unfortunate that Lonely and the Unknowns had the same plan, as he was now left stuck. He looked at Silver, then back at Nova before seeing the navy backpack and groaning. He pushed on Nova's leg with his paw, getting her to turn to him. At first, he looked away, but then noticed that her searing gaze wasn't going anywhere. Nova's mouth opened slightly before he asked, "You okay if I hide in your bag? If not, fine by me." Nova smiled, watching his face twist in agitation at the prospect of asking a potential traitor for help. That said, she knelt down, moving a few things around in her bag before opening it wide enough for him to step inside. Hee gave her a look of cautious anger before getting in. As he got comfortable, Nova carefully closed the backpack most of the way, mostly trying to avoid hurting him with the zippers. She turned her head upon finishing, getting ready to ask Silver if he needed help, only to see him taking the form of his character pre-death, of course. "Guess I didn't need to ask," she said, watching Loneliness move around in the front pocket of his hoodie. She even saw the Unknowns adjusting into the hood of his hoodie briefly before Silver said with a semi-confident smile, "Yeah, a couple of other gaming pastas taught me how to do this, just in case." Nova just nodded, carefully swinging the bag over her shoulders so as not to hurt Hee. As they walked through the town, people would occasionally stop them to get pictures with Silver in his trainer cosplay before they would continue once more. As soon as they were leaving the more populated areas of town, there was a tension filling Silver's chest. Hee would struggle in the backpack trying to find a more comfortable position, much to the slight annoyance of Nova. Loneliness would peek out of Silver's pocket every once in a while, and wondered what would be out this far away from people. Then they stopped in a place that seemed like a dead end, in a seemingly abandoned parking garage. Silver, for once, was pissed. He figured now that he had a right to worry, and was about to curse her out when something changed. Nova formed a ball of blue light above her hand and aimed it at part of the wall. Silver freaked, thinking that she was going to destroy the wall with the ball of light. But then a large door appeared, now filled with symbols and characters. All of them emitted the same color of light. "The hell?" Silver asked, only to see Nova's shoulders shake with a little laughter. Then she had claws made of the same light appear on the tips of her fingers on her right hand. She slowly slid the claws between some of the barely visible slots in the round door, causing the glowing symbols to get a little brighter before she removed her claws. The door rolled away to the left very slowly, revealing a long concrete encased hallway, with light and noise on the other side. "Are you ready to get out of my bag?" she asked, looking over her shoulder as her bag shifted again. "Of course, it's stuffy in here," moaned E from inside. Loneliness wriggled out of Silver's pocket, and the unknowns returned to their rightful place, floating around Silver. Nova set down her backpack, unzipping it to let him out, and E stretched. He was trying to get some feeling back in his paws. "Okay," Nova said, making sure they were listening before she continued. "This place isn't normal, granted, neither are we, but this isn't like your typical creepypasta territory. With that said, I'll let you experience this place a little bit for yourselves before I lay down any rules." They all seemed a bit confused by this revelation, but they followed her down the hallway, the door closing behind them slowly as they walked closer to the light, and they heard massive amounts of commotion. Some stuff sounded familiar to them, while other things didn't. It was only when they passed the end of the hallway that they could see what was making so much noise. There were kids running around. Some looked like demons, while others the groups weren't even sure about. That said, Nova recognized elves, demons, wendigos, ghosts, fairies, etc. in every single cage, shop, and customers even. "Now, let me tell you the rules here," Nova said, causing the Pokepastas to look at her. 1. Your creepypasta status does not hold weight here, as creepypastas don't know about this little black market, so they don't do business here. 2. Don't pick a fight with people. People will take advantage of that, and if you cause trouble. 3. Try not to engage with the shopkeepers. They're more than a little persistent out here than any other shop I've been to. And finally, 4. Stick close to me. I've made a good reputation for myself out here over the past 2 years or so. People will be less likely to mess with you because of that. They all seemed to nod. Then he asked, "Wait, you got all that stuff here, and you still had to come back?" Nova nodded. "I'm able to pay for things by doing favors for the shopkeepers, within reason, anyway. I had a job from an owner in a local tavern, and I wasn't able to do that yesterday. Plus, Silas and I have a close relationship. He sees me as an additional member of the family, and so I don't really feel like I can ignore him." Then, a loud screeching sound pierced the air. Silver, E, and Loneliness drew much closer to Nova. She almost laughed as they seemed to circle around her for protection. The unknowns seemed to glare at her before Silver added, "Hey, not funny!" This only served to make Nova actually laugh more before saying, "It's only funny because the first time I had been at this little black market, I did the same." There was probably just a fight breaking out between a banshee and one of the witches out here. E and Silver grumbled, backing up a little bit in annoyance. Lonely stuck by her feet, still being pretty freaked out by this huge new place. Fairies flew by them, seeming to investigate the group as they walked along. "Tomes for magic!" cried one shop owner desperately, causing E and Silver to get closer to Nova once more. "Fresh meat!" A demonic voice chimed in, causing Lonely to nearly jump into Nova's arms. Nova began to pet the shaking Evie as they got closer to a more central hub within the market. At the very center of this hub was a rustic-looking tavern. There were a few tables outside, each looking like a circular, metal-rimmed wooden shield. They were supported by the same metal that rimmed the tables and stood on a single pole and foot. The name of the tavern was written in 3 or more languages that seemed to flip around depending on who was reading. Silas's Demon Alehouse, Silver muttered, seeming to be in awe of the inviting-looking building. Yep, Nova said, still petting Loneliness on the head. Silas takes pride in making everyone feel welcome. That includes the sign there. So that's why I can read it? He asked in surprise, only to suddenly look away out of jealousy towards Lonely. Loneliness looked at E and then at the tavern. Please tell me we're going in there, he said, starting to shake. Nova nodded, only to add an additional confirmation to her statement. Yep, that's where Silas is, so don't worry. They all scurried into the tavern, noticing the stark difference between the market outside and the inside of the tavern. People were talking calmly. Casual conversation made the place almost feel like a normal, human restaurant. I'll be right with you, a raspy, demonic voice seemed to chime through the place. Just take a seat anywhere. Nova seemed to smile. She gently set down Loneliness, who seemed much more calm. I'm here on business, but my friends and I can sit for a spell, Nova said, earning a chuckle from the voice. The people and creatures looked towards her, like they recognized her by voice alone. Some smiled, others waved at her, while more still playfully pushed her. The dynamics seemed to fall into place as they made their way into the empty booth, in an empty space of the tavern. So, what is this place? Loneliness asked. And how can you endure all that stuff outside? I mean, you said it was like a black market, but... Silver, E, and the Unknowns looked at Nova for explanation. I call it a black market because they sell things out there that most markets like this one don't. Or that other markets just won't touch. This particular market is actually called Elf Forest, as it was started by a few dark elves over a couple of 100 years ago. You can find anything from magic spells to information, that is, if you can pay for it. The sellers and people who frequent this place do live by some sort of code, so nothing passes through here that is world-ending. That said, not everything sold is ethical either, but generally the people here are decent. I won't say the place isn't jarring for a first-timer. The general bustle takes some getting used to. You were shaking like a leaf the first time you came in here, kiddo, the raspy demonic voice chimed in. You tried to play it off, but I could tell you were freaked out too. Granted, you did find this place by accident. Silas! Good to see you, old man, Nova exclaimed it lightly. Looking at Silas, one could see a set of intense-looking gray eyes. He had large, twisted-looking horns that pointed behind him, with ruddy red scales that dotted his pale yellow skin. He was a little chubby, and appeared to have a few years on him. Silas laughed. Her comments were nothing new to him at this point. You too, kiddo. Now, dude, I have a job for you? Nova nodded, causing the others to watch their interaction carefully. Before we begin, would you and your friends like a meal on the house? Nova nodded, and shortly after they ordered, their food showed up. Nova smiled. Okay, so fill me in. What do you need from me, old man? It's kind of a big job, which brings me to why you had so many jobs yesterday. Silas replied kindly. It's something my dad brought up for me a little over 2 weeks ago, she admitted. I needed to be able to get into contact with some operators. Long story short, I hoped I'd be able to get some info. That and these guys are staying at my place, and I wanted to make sure I had groceries. And something to help them with fighting due to the info I got from Dad. Sorry about not getting to your job yesterday. Silas shook his head, seeming to be okay, knowing that Nova wasn't just one to turn down a job if she could do it. So these three are creepypastas as well, kiddo? Silas asked. Nova nodded, introducing each of them to Silas, and then explaining why they were with her. Ah, that makes sense, especially with your specific group. Hunters have gotten a bit more nuts, and those collars sound familiar, Silas replied, rubbing his temples. Nova nodded in agreement. Then they both seemed to remember the reason she was actually there. Right, the job, Silas said, a new expression crossing his face. People around here have noticed a disturbing trend. One of our local auction houses has been selling people, live people, as well as lesser beings, workers from shops, and regulars. The thing is, none of us were here to raise a hand against the head of the auction house. He would find a way to make us pay. As it stands, he took my daughter and is planning on selling her today. So my job is for you to kill him. I know that everyone else is too terrified, and you don't shy away from any job, so... Nova stared in disbelief, surprised that anything this taboo by the people who worked there would happen. She sighed. Smaller branch or the trunk? The trunk? Silas admitted sheepishly. That's why people out here are so freaked. This job comes at a hefty price, you know. Nova admitted. We can work out the details as we're relatively close. I know we'll work things out. Hunters involved? Silas shook his head. There is another regular who's a pasta. He's been missing too, though sources say he was looking into some info on a similar problem when he went missing. That, and I think Mr. Winters was the last person he talked to, so he might be there too. She smirked, her black hole-like eyes gaining a mischievous glow to them. You know, I'd be pretty pissed for you dragging me into all these things that could get me killed, if we weren't so close. Silas laughed, playfully hitting her back. The group finished their food with Silas offering to make keys for Silver, E, and Loneliness to come back whenever they wanted to. She made sure it was something that they wanted, and made part of his payment for the job, as they seemed genuinely interested. Once they had finished eating, Silas urged them to hurry, as Corin, Mr. Winters, would begin his auction soon. Don't worry, Silas, Nova said, pulling her broken mask from her bag. We'll be back faster than you can blink. Good luck, kiddo, he cried, as she headed back into the market they had left behind. So, do we have a plan? Silver whispered into her ears. None of us have been here before. Lonely started to freak out a bit, only to have E walk up next to him to comfort him. We'll play to our strengths, Nova says. E is the best fighter in your group, so he'll run offense outside of myself. You and Loneliness both have skills good for distractions, as well as inducing fear. So you'll be in charge of keeping people from catching up to us or catching on before we want them to. I like this plan. E seemed to let his demonic tone fill with delight. With that said, Lonely added, I can use some of my curses to make people see things that aren't there. Silver smiled, his void eyes gaining a red glow. I can use that as an advantage to send the unknowns all over the place. Nova appreciated their optimism, even if she couldn't tell if they actually trusted her or not. They approached the Bluebell, with optimism being replaced with focus and tension. I'll get us our ticket inside, Nova said. We need to remain discreet for now. The group nodded as she conversed with the man at the front door. The group stood a little ways away until Nova waved them over casually. You know you're the only person I'd allow to do this before an auction, right? An overly pompous yet proper-sounding voice stated as Silver, E, and Loneliness approached. Let alone would I have ever let them inside if you weren't their friend. Nova gave a kind laugh as Silver rounded the corner with his unknowns, and the other two in tow. The auction house was seemingly out of the only white building one could see, and the inside was extremely extravagant and posh-looking. Silver E. Loneliness, this is Corin Winters, and he's agreed to let us explore, Nova said with a wink, letting them know that this was their target. Silver faked a smile, making sure to shake hands with him. Nice to meet you, Mr. Winters. The pleasure's mine, boy. He spoke, seeming to enunciate the word boy purposefully. Silver felt like his skin was crawling after meeting this icy individual. He was covered in black veins and blue skin, and had pitch-colored eyes. He wore an expensive-looking suit and had long white hair pulled back into a low ponytail. His pointed ears gave him away as some sort of elf, but his disdain for others was almost painfully obvious. It's nice to meet you, Mr. Winters, Loneliness said from next to Nova's legs. E seemed trying to gauge their target when the man looked down at both of him and Loneliness curiously. Those two could fetch a good price, given the right buyer, he said, his voice seeming to be semi-lost in thought. They're not for sale, Nova and Silver said in an odd unison. Corin looked at both of them, giving a slight ignored expression before focusing his venom on Nova. Now, Miss Nova, you can't just bring prime real estate with you and expect me not to make an assessment. Silver looked as though he was about to snap. His deathly figure looked like it was beginning to bleed anew. When he opened his mouth to retort, he was shocked when heat filled the area that they stood in. Then Nova spoke up. Corin Winters, Nova said with a voice that sounded deathly cold. I told you in advance that these were my friends that I was inviting. In no capacity did I tell you I was bringing a product to sell. So there is no need for any real estate assessment. I'd suggest biting down on your tongue hard, or there will be reason for a damage assessment. A blue glow engulfed her, and Corin suddenly looked horrified. And if one were to look closer, they would notice him looking at her eyes, and that they were reflecting in his. Corin cleared his throat, suddenly looking away from him. You're right, absolutely right, forgive me. His apology was abrupt, like the ability to form a more formal apology had been shot. Nova nodded, seeming to barely be able to control her rage. With that said, Corin nodded. Yes, I did agree that you could get first crack before the auctions began. This way, please. Corin seemed to speed away, leaving Silver to ask, You okay? Nova nodded, her eyes becoming more gentle as she looked over at him. Yeah, I'll be even better when I can kill him. Damn straight, E growled, almost yipping in the process. Loneliness looked at Silver for comfort. I hate him. Silver petted him and asked, So, how do we attack this? Nova saw Corin waiting and mumbled, You guys explore the main area and distract any workers from heading to the back. E, you stick with me and keep your cool. I'm gonna struggle with that too, so don't worry. Silver nodded, seeming to lead Lonely down an opposite hallway while E and Nova walked over to Corin. He now refused to look E in the eye when addressing the two of them. Shall we then? Nova nodded, causing Corin to speed forward once again. E was barely suppressing a growl as they made their way to storage. Corin kept trying to shoot apologetic looks at E, only for such apologies to be outright ignored. When they were just outside the storage room, Nova looked at Corin. He hastily opened the door and said, "Shall I show you today's offerings?" "I'll be right in," Nova said. "Just give me a moment to calm my friend." Corin nodded and scrambled inside, leaving the door slightly ajar for her. "So I'd bring you along, but," Nova said. He nodded, only saying, "Don't worry, I can take my anger out on any pompous assholes that don't have a problem with what he's doing." Nova almost laughed, wishing him good luck as she followed Corin inside. Corin almost looked relieved, seeing that it was just Nova. While they walked through the room, Nova took note of every cage, box, and crate. There were aqua dragons, lesser demons, younger than Silas was, phantoms, children, young adults of the human variety. Every person or creature she could see or either looked confused or scared, betrayed, angry, or all of the above. Nova paused a couple times, looking at some specific cages. Silas's daughter was sitting towards the back. Her purple eyes glowed dimly in a dimly lit area she was being housed in. Another place she paused was in front of a cage with a man in it. His outfit looked a bit messy, but he had bright golden colored eyes, gray skin, and his pants were shackled so that no one could see his hands. She somehow recognized him as the puppeteer, and it enraged her. The final pause she made was in front of her purchase, a dog-looking creature. She was instantly drawn to it. The dog had its skeleton on the outside with purple fur underneath it. Its eyes were a piercing green color, and it had multiple sets of razor-sharp teeth. It barked harshly, growling and sounding like hundreds of dogs barking all at once. "Ah," Corin said. He had long since slipped back into his typical persona. "The Blaze Hound! You have wonderful tastes. If you can train the bitch." The Blaze Hound barked louder, being riled up by Corin even speaking. Nova wanted to kill him right there and then, but it was too risky. The workers were in charge of keeping things clean, and she had seen several in their walkthrough so far. So she did something that would even scare Corin, and put her hand between the bars of the cage. Corin, who had been laughing at the Blaze Hound's enraged barks, now went deathly silent. The Blaze Hound froze, staring at Nova in a level of surprise before even sniffing her hand. It sniffed her intently, trying to gauge what she was smelling on her hand. And then she proceeded to happily lick the fingers like a normal dog would, causing Nova to giggle. The Blaze Hound let out a calm bark before it leaned its skull against her hand. Nova petted her for a bit before saying, "I think Ember and I will get along just fine, Corin." She removed her hand from the cage slowly, and as she stood, she noticed that Corin looked pale. "Miss Nova, I'd urge you to be more careful. That said, we'll head to my office and we can fill out the paperwork." Corin said, giving her a stern look, "Would you like a worker to collect her for you?" Nova shook her head, giving him a victorious smile. "No, I'll collect her myself. That said, I wouldn't agitate the beings you sell if you don't want people to be reckless." Corin turned on his heels and headed towards his office. Nova was preparing to kill the moment the door to his office closed. Meanwhile, Silver and Loneliness were exploring the halls of Bluebell. They would occasionally run into one of the workers. Although Lonely had been brushing his fluffy tail against the wall, imbuing them with curses, many people would just run at the sight of Silver. "So, what do we do if we have to run damage control?" Loneliness asked. Another worker scurried past them in fear. Silver smiled, looking over at the impatient Evie. "Don't worry, we'll get a chance, and when we do, we'll turn it up to an 11. Lonely seemed to jump excitedly at this prospect, causing a soft chuckle from Silver while they walked around. They would hear some of the workers talking, most of them in extremely hushed tones. What's he doing? What he's doing is wrong, though, Silver and Loneliness both heard from just behind them. We can't fight him, though, the other voice snapped. Besides, he sold your sister last week because of this. And now he's let some strange magical beings into the auction house. I heard they're friends of Nova's, the other voice spoke when a girl ran past them down the hall. The girl looked horrified. Her skin was pale and she almost looked sick. Black hole. Mr. Winters, dead, killed, the girl said between labored breaths. The others began to ask her what was wrong when Loneliness caused curses to make them see things. Silver smiled, feeling somewhat bad as they didn't seem to agree with their employer's methods. That said, he nodded, and then his unknown scattered to distract other employees. Corin was terrified, seeing the darker side of Nova for the first time on full display. He already had a huge gash in his leg, and it was sizzling and popping. Tears pricked at the corner of his eyes. You're a friend, well, so why? He said, despite the pain ripping through his body. Oh, Mr. Winters. Her voice was in a sing-songy tone, muffled slightly by her broken mask. You forfeit that side of me when I found out you were selling your fellow shopkeepers. In fact, you forfeit that when you decided to sell human beings. So let's ask this. Corin tried to freeze her while she buried her claws into him repeatedly. She landed solid punches cloaked in hot radiated fire as he tried to beat her back, his black blood spilling across every inch of the room when she continued. Did your life have value? And did you think these sins would go unpunished? As she finished the final question, she heard him yell briefly before a sickening sound of his skull crushing filled the room. His body was still, and Nova prevented herself from laughing hysterically. His body almost began to look paper white now that he was dead. The screams of his workers sounded as they were either being killed for being okay with his methods, or scared as a distraction. The same could be said for the buyers, who had been waiting patiently in their respective auction rooms. Nova walked past the elves who had died like their employer, and through the groups of terrified people. She now held the keys he had kept in his desk, and proceeded to free every individual whom he had imprisoned for sale. Things became a bit more of a blur between individuals asking her if they should help the humans return home, and animals being called by others who had been imprisoned. By the time things had settled and the shopkeepers had decided who would take over the auction house, it felt like days had passed her by. Eventually, the stage would be ended by a familiar voice calling out to her, "Nova, over here!" Nova looked over, seeing Silver return her gaze with a smile. Nova grinned ear to ear and then felt something brush against her hand. The blaze hound was licking her fingers again, cleaning the blood off of her hands. She giggled a little, petting Ember again. Come on, girlie, let's go home. Ember barked, following her as she rejoined the Pokepostas on the other side of the crowd. Ian looked at the dog following her before saying, "Couldn't resist taking a pet home, could you?" She almost laughed along with Silver at E's comment, while Loneliness sniffed her and tried to make friends. Eventually they all walked back to Silas's tavern, not noticing an individual following them from the auction house. Silas was out front, hugging his daughter tightly when the group approached. "Thank you," Silas cheered upon seeing them. "I see you freed Pup, too." The group turned to see Puppeteer had been following them. "Nice to finally meet," Nova said, breaking the awkward silence that had hit their group. Puppeteer bowed, giving an almost mischievous smile as he did. I should be thanking you, and the pleasure's mine. His voice was smooth, raspy, and it echoed all at once. Silver sighed, surprised that he was meeting this strange creature, as pastas hardly ever interacted. The only exception to this rule would be when they were working under an operator. I'm Silver, that's E and Loneliness, Silver said, nodding to the Eevees. Ah, I've actually heard of you. All of you, he replied. His tone came off as kind. Though you seem new, but you're different from a lot of us too. Nova smiled, finally removing the mask from her face. Where are my manners? I'm Nova. I've been out here for 2 years. Thank you, Puppeteer said with a calm smile. All of you, I mean it. Silver smiled, nodding, and overall being surprised that Puppeteer was even this kind. Loneliness managed a tired, cheering cry, and E gave his equivalent to a kind smile, his split tail wrapping around his front paws. With all things settled, Silas said, sounding a bit more chipper than when this all began, allow me to give you a quick path home. Oh, and Pup, here! Silas handed Puppeteer a bottle with a drink in it. When you get the chance, tell me what you think. Silas beamed. I know you don't drink, so it's not alcohol. Puppeteer chuckled. An almost snake-like smile crossed his face, though all involved could tell it was genuine and kind. Sure thing, Si, he said in a friendly tone. After a few more moments, Silas had set up a temporary door that started on a path just on the edge of the clearing to Nova's house. They all wished Silas a good day, with a knowing look passing between Nova and Silas before the door closed. Do you need to rest, Pup? Nova asked, after passing through the door. Puppeteer shook his head, though he did seem to appreciate the offer. I just want to go home and rest. That said, I think telling people about you could be fun. Puppeteer seemed to grin when mentioning it, if you don't mind. Nova nodded, almost laughing at his mischievous smirk. No problems here. Actually, that might be more helpful than you think. Puppeteer gave her a confused look, only to smile and nod before disappearing into the woods from around her house. He had formed golden thread as he walked, seemingly for fun. Then Nova turned to her new pet, Ember, and the other pastas, currently staying with her. We good? Silver almost laughed. We were wrong. Sorry, Nova. You're alright, I guess, he added. Just tell us where you're going next time. Loneliness resisted the urge to shoot a glare at E before saying, We're really sorry, Nova. Ember seemed to generally look back and forth between Nova and the others before she watched her smile. Ember prevented herself from barking with joy when Nova spoke. Hey, my plan wasn't to hold stuff against you anyway, so no worries. I should have said something the first time. They all seemed to become much calmer. Ember barked happily, earning a laugh from her new owner and friends. As time went on, Nova would spend days practicing with the group. She would willingly let Loneliness and Silver practice jumping in and out of electronics as defense. She taught Silver how to use a knife and what the Pokeball weapons were for. He could imagine a Pokemon and it would briefly appear as an extra defense. E would teach Loneliness the ability Kill, and in return, Loneliness would teach E his form of the ability Curse. They would often go back and forth between Elf Forest and the house for tomes, healing potions, and food when they were running low. None of them had noticed a month had passed, and that it was December 6th. It was about noon when they ended their training session for that day. Nova stretched a little ways away from Silver, E, Lonely, and Ember. Jeez, she's intense during training, E whined, stretching his paws. She can be, but she just wants us to be prepared, you know, Loneliness argued, while tiredly stretching. Don't fight, you guys, Silver said bluntly. I'm too tired for this. E and Loneliness laughed a bit, and Ember just laid there watching them. She was panting, exhausted from her training herself, but still grateful to be here as opposed to the cages she had been in. Her ear twitched slightly, having heard something. She slowly raised her head. Nova seemed to hear something more, and whipped around with a worried look before a word could leave her lips. She heard a growl, followed by the following sentence. Spread the word. Everyone froze, seeing a red husky with black markings behind him. And behind him, a taller-looking young man with stitches extending from the corners of his mouth, and a long gray and black striped scarf. The other two were a woman with black hair and a paper white face with a demonic-looking link. Nova's eyes dimmed just before the attack, and then, with no warning, the group charged. Lou made a break for Nova, only to have Ember pounce in front of him. Move, he said in a monotone voice, his green eyes looking awfully dull. Ember barked, being careful to read the man in front of her. Lou kicked at her hard, but Ember jumped out of the way just enough to be missed. Then she snapped seemingly at his hand to grab his sleeve and pulled him back hard. Lou seemed to have stumbled for a bit before kicking Ember in the side a few times. Ember could barely feel each kick, but pretended to yipe in pain and fall. Once she could tell his guard was down, and that he was planning to stab her, she jumped up. Her jump was just high enough to overpower him, and she ripped off the collar from his unconscious body. While this was happening, E saw Smile charging for Ember at the same time as Nova. He took the opportunity to go after the demonic mutt, while Nova agreed to let Silver do something. It was when he got up close and dealt a quick slash to the side of Smile's face. Your souls are mine, he cried in anger, whipping towards E. I'd like to see you take my soul. Show me that, E cried brashly. Just then, Smile grinned sadistically and widely. He charged at E at full speed, not giving E the chance to attack quickly. He repeated the process a few times until Nova kicked Smile in the snout. Back the fuck off! She screamed in rage. Smile seemed amused by this, even if there was a methodical look in his eyes, not allowing for all his true emotions to show. Your blood, your soul, your hate, they're all mine. He chuckled, howls and barks following every word. Are you prepared, little girl? Are you prepared to spread the word? Nova tried to fight him off a couple times, only to eventually get overwhelmed by him. He kept snapping at her face, her neck, causing her to put her arms between herself and his teeth. He was trying to kill her for what felt like ages, until his weight was suddenly gone. Nova sat up quickly, seeing Ember next to her, and Smile slowly standing up after appearing to have been rammed into one of the nearby trees. Leave them! Leave her! You kill them, then I'll torture you! Barked out Ember clearly. Nova seemed surprised to hear her speak. She watched as Smile growled and tried to topple her over, only to be knocked back repeatedly. All the while, Silver had gotten permission to use Nova's phone. His idea had been to keep disappearing into the phone, only to be able to disable Ben in a couple of times with the static. This had worked a few times, despite Silver still struggling a bit with the skill. You've met a terrible fate, haven't you? Ben asked, sounding incredibly tired. Silver almost laughed, saying, Sounds more like you, old friend. With that, he landed a solid right hook to Ben's face, causing him to black out. Silver was just surprised it had been that easy, as he had his unknowns helping out Loneliness. Loneliness had a surprisingly easy fight too, even when he started without Silver's help. Jane seemed to be in a bit of a daze, where she would cry for a little bit, not that any of them knew why. So when Loneliness noticed her become unfocused, the unknowns would float around her, allowing for Lonely to curse to make her tired. She eventually got knocked over by him, and blacked out on impact at the forest floor. It was that when Smile realized they couldn't win that he chose the closest person to him and dragged them back into the woods. That person just so happened to be Jane at the time. As they left, Nova looked at Silver, who seemed to be a bit concerned. "Will Ben be okay?" Silver asked her. Nova smiled, finding his concern to be sweet. Then she answered, "I hope so. We can bring him and Lou back to the house with us. First things first, though." Nova knelt down and cut the collar off the boy's neck. She looked back to see Ember very carefully placing Lou on her back and smiled. She smiled, then asked, "Got Ben?" Silver nodded. With the help of E and Loneliness, they were able to get him back to her place. They got the two pastas comfortable and began to plan their next move. Adventures of Ryzoth, Pasta Sauce, Chapter 3, Operators, Proxies, and Miscommunications. Slender had watched from a distance for far too long, and his anger had only grown with the fact that he had to keep Kate and Charles hidden away. He had even begun to revert to some of his old ways of killing when he found his prey. He heard a childish-like scream and cry after finishing with the corpse of a young woman. "Slender, help!" cried the voice of a young boy. Slender found himself teleporting in front of the half-skeletal boy, whom he had gained control of many years ago. Slender seemed to freeze, seeing the boy tied up with golden threads. His blank face seemed to devolve, beginning to form dark pits where his eyes would be, and a mouth of black color cut through his paper-white face. "Puppeteer!" he howled in anger, only to earn some laughter. Puppeteer released Charles, causing the young boy to fall, and Slender just barely caught him with his tentacles. "The hell are you doing here?" he called out, trying to locate the ghostly gray entity. Charles looked up at his operator. Taking note of his anger, the proxy shook like a leaf for the first time in many years. "Things have gotten interesting as of late, haven't they?" he asked, finally becoming visible to the tall demon. "A few weeks ago, I didn't even think I'd be here. But now, seeing hunters taking people, your proxies or not, that has to bite." Slender growled inhumanly. "Get to the point!" "Forgive me," Puppeteer said, raising his hands defensively. "I knew playing with your proxy would get your attention, as I wanted to bring a young lady, a new pasta, if you will, to your attention." Slender's expression seemed to relax. Despite the minor annoyance with the puppeteer, he couldn't help but think that operators had to stick together this time. "Why?" he asked, crossing his arms before nodding to Charles, telling him to head back to the house with Kate. "What does a young lady have to do with anything you've brought up?" Charles quietly and quickly scurried away as Puppeteer replied, "This young lady is fairly new to the scene. To be frank, she's even made some friends." Slender sighed as a response, but his avoidance to press him allowed for Puppeteer to continue. And as he did, Slender got a picture painted for him of a young lady with dark hair and the description of her black hole mask that matched her eyes. Slender recognized that from the eyes of Jeff and even the eyes of Ben more recently. Slender began to shake. "You say this lady saved you?" Puppeteer nodded. He seemed to be confused by the sudden resurgence of rage. Slender calmed himself down and then spoke up once more. "Where is she now?" Puppeteer told him, despite his concern with doing this. "Are you planning on paying her a visit?" Slender just nodded and disappeared before it even crossed Pup's mind to go home and send Cora to warn her in advance. "I feel as though I have made a grave mistake," he muttered on his way off of Slender's turf. "I just hope she'll be able to handle the storm." Tin on wood clicked with each step she made. When she was by the window, she saw her master. "Puppeteer, sir!" she called, saluting the gray-skinned ghost who became her master 10 years ago. "Thank you for waiting for me, Cora," Puppeteer said, a calm smile crossing his face. "Could you get Soldier and meet me in the upper rooms?" Cora blinked, seeing that Puppeteer looked unnerved by something. "Of course, master," she said with a soft-spoken tone. "Did something happen when you visited the Twisted Woods?" Puppeteer seemed to sigh, giving her the cue to leave and just to do as he asked. Cora sped down the hallway to go collect Soldier from his room. All the while, she could only wonder what had transpired between him and the Slender Man. "I could hear you down the hall, Cora," Soldier whined, opening his door. "I swear the only time you don't make a sound is when we're doing a job for Puppeteer." Cora almost laughed at Soldier before speaking. "I'm here because our Puppeteer wants to talk with us in the upper rooms." Soldier froze, looking almost apologetic for his earlier comments. "Right," he said, now speed-walking from his room to the stairwell. "You coming, Tin?" Cora smirked, more casually following the Soldier and her fellow proxy. Once they got up to Puppeteer's room, attention seemed to cut across the group. Soldiers stood up more straight, and Tin was gripping at her fingers, twisting them until Puppeteer spoke. "I have told you about a young Nova, correct?" he asked in a more business-like tone. "The young lady who saved you in the market?" Soldier asked, taking a cautious step forward. "What's wrong? Has she threatened us?" Cora looked at Soldier. Although his concern for their master was their respected trait, sometimes both her and Puppeteer would note that he would jump to conclusions. Puppeteer looked at him with a calm and patient smile before continuing. "At ease, Soldier. It's nothing like that. I went to Slender's forest to speak to him about her, and now it seems to me he's planning to do her harm." Soldier and Tin looked at each other and then back at him. It seemed odd to the two that a young pasta saving an operator of any kind would enrage anyone at this time. "Do we know why that is?" Cora asked, finding the words no one else could. "I'm afraid not. He didn't tell me why, but he did demand the location of her home," Puppeteer replied, turning his gaze toward the only window in his room. "With that said, hunters haven't been hugely prevalent in this area currently. This means I have jobs for both of you." Both Cora, Tyndall, and Soldier nodded, both of them becoming intensely focused. "Tin, you are to warn Nova and her friends that Slender Man's coming for blood. And Soldier, keep your eyes out and look for other information on hunters and their collections." Tin seemed to be a bit confused by this division of work, but Soldier was the one who ultimately voiced those concerns. "It's not that I don't think Tin can handle herself, sir. But if Slender were to come, wouldn't you want her to have some sort of backup?" Puppeteer looked at Tin, who seemed to nod in agreement with her fellow proxy.
Pup smiled in understanding. He completely understood that Sunder may very well keep pace with her, but risking both of them for that wasn't an option at the time. I know, he said, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. This plan is reckless. That said, even though you are both important, it's because of that risking sending the both of you on the same job is worse. If you finish your work early or she desperately needs your help, I'll change your objective, soldier. Same goes for you too, Ten. Both of them seemed to be a bit more at ease, and Puppeteer smiled, grateful that his toys were much calmer. As Soldier and Tin prepared for departure, Pup dug around in his belongings. He had hidden some of his purchases from Elk Forest in there, and a set of amulets felt appropriate for his proxies to carry with them this time. Meanwhile, Soldier had started to talk to Tin, mostly due to the worry about what was going to happen. Do you think things are going to be okay? He asked, pulling an army green hoodie over his military-style uniform. Tin gave a shaky smile, her body making creaky sounds as she answered, No, soldier, I'm fine, honestly. With the hoodie firmly in its place, he could take a moment to study his fellow proxy. And dear friend. He wrapped his arms around her, causing the young proxy to freeze. Soldier, what are you? Soldier hummed to silence her. You're a terrible liar, Tin. You really are. Tin went from stiff to slightly slumped. Even if I am afraid, worried, whatever, I'm not allowed to deny him, and neither are you. Soldier let go of Tin, allowing her to turn around. Her face was contorted by anxiety, and she looked into his face, then quickly back to the floor. I'm just worried about failing this, Tin muttered, pulling at the hem of her knee-high red dress. Soldier carefully studied her short build, his gaze between the intricate patterns on the dress, then to her lightly shining pale-colored skin. Her face was framed by a set of thick auburn curls, and her eyes were a glassy pale blue. She looked tired, but that seemed to be normal for them now. He sighed and muttered, Close your eyes. I want to give you something. Tin looked up at him, her eyes meeting his deep brown-colored ones. What? She asked. Before Soldier repeated, Close your eyes. I want to give you something. Tin closed her eyes. Confusion and worry about this gift made her face scrunch up. Soldier laughed softly. I'm not pranking you. Relax, Cora. Cora opened her eyes, glaring at him slightly. Last time you did this, she retorted, you placed a spider in my hair and it wasn't funny. She stomped, staring at the man in annoyance. She watched the pale-faced man beam, laughing even harder than when she was concerned earlier. Troy! She whined, getting him to wipe a tear from his eyes with his jointed, wooden-looking hand. Sorry, he said, catching his breath after a fit of laughter. I learned my lesson from last time, I promise, Cora. Please, just close your eyes and trust me. Cora groaned, closing her eyes begrudgingly. You pull anything funny? Before she could complete her statement, she felt a peck on her forehead. She felt heat rush to her face faster than she could even think, and then heard Troy's voice in her ear. Use this moment as a badge of courage, and when we both come back, we'll discuss what just happened, okay? Cora nodded, quickly turning around and pulling on her light brown leather trench coat. Troy stayed silent too, tying his set of combat boots before the two of them waited by the door for Puppeteer. In between awkward silences and Puppeteer giving them the amulets, they both were asking themselves questions. As Tin scurried out the door, Soldier was stopped by Pup briefly. "Yes, sir?" Soldier asked, facing his golden-eyed master. "I give you my blessing on that, you know. Just make sure it's something she wants." Soldier smiled thankfully, heading out the door as Puppeteer watched. Back at Nova's, she had been treating Lou despite his constant attempts to end her life. She would often need E's help to hold him down while they gave him and Ben healing potions. But everything seemed fine on Lou's end. Ben, on the other hand, was not so lucky. Ben had been incredibly silent, still, and everything else, to the point where everyone was worried. People even wondered if the ghost boy was even still alive. Despite the few times Lou had tried to escape, though, he couldn't bring himself to do it anymore. He couldn't leave his fellow pasta, and he wasn't quite sure why. Nova was about to go upstairs to try to figure stuff out again, when Lonely walked over. "I know you're busy," he said, placing his face against her leg. "But Silver and E wanted me to tell you that we'll be training outside." Nova leaned down to pet his head, her hand gently stroking him in between the ears. "Thank you for telling me, but you guys don't have to tell me every time, you know." A soft laugh escaped her lips. "Just if you're planning to leave for a while. I know Silver wants to talk to me about something, but he wants to make sure Ben is fine first. So I want to make sure to help him. So I'm sorry if I've been too dismissive." Lonely emanated an Eevee cry before speaking. "It's okay. I'll let them know. And don't overwork yourself, okay?" "I'll try, Lonely," she called after him as he scurried outside. As he left the door, she heard someone walk back up the stairs. She saw a brief moment of boots on the steps, and she sighed. Okay. Time to prepare for another round of questions from Jeff's brother. She took a few steps up the stairs, only to see him waiting for her, right at the top of them. "Getting bolder, are we?" she asked, looking him in the eyes. Lou scowled at her. Then he spoke up. "Between you pinning me down and forcing me to drink God knows what, you suddenly notice that I've been getting bold?" His voice had a rough edge, but otherwise it was surprisingly smooth. Nova just sighed. "If you hadn't drunk those healing potions, you'd probably be dead right now." Lou seemed to freeze. He was confused by her statement, as she squeezed her way past him. When he noticed that she was headed towards the empty room across from hers, he ran to catch up with her. "Healing potions?" he yelled after her. "You have to be nuts!" Nova shook her head in annoyance as she approached a very still and still very quiet Ben. "You live with ghosts and demons all around you, but healing potions, that's where you draw the line, eh, Lou?" Nova's tone was almost bored sounding, and Lou was about to scream at her again when he noticed just how focused she was. It annoyed him that she could shift gears so readily, all while stating that she cared. Ben seemed to glitch out while she tried to wrap wounds that refused to heal. "This shit's getting me nowhere," she muttered in agitation. "No answers from Silas on the collars and no help from Dad or other Asters." Lou just sat down on the bed he had been using and crossed his arms before stating, "If you're here to help, why is he getting worse?" A heat filled the room briefly as Nova's head slowly turned to face the seemingly aloof Lou. "I am doing my damnedest! I am doing everything I know how to do, and I can do. For crying out loud, Lou! You can't tell me you'd do any better!" Those words cut through the silence, and she drew closer to him. He slid back until his back was against the wall. Lou raised his hands defensively when they heard a loud thud followed by demonic cries. Lou looked out the door only to feel dizzy and step back into the room. He was about to suggest who might be out there when an angry voice filled the house. "Nova, get out here or your friends die!" "Stay here with Ben," Nova growled, an unearthly echo filling her voice. "Make sure he stays alive, and if things get bad, get out of here and take Ben with you." Lou was about to argue with her, but Nova was already gone. When he turned back to face Ben, he saw that he was struggling to stay up. A little bit before, Slender seemed to have shown up. Tin Doll had finally made it to the abandoned-looking house that Nova had been said to be staying in. She dreaded the thought that Slender may have been following her since she'd left her master's place. It had taken her about a day, and in a snow-filled forest the trek had been difficult. Although she didn't feel really cold, per se, it felt like the steps that she took would lead to her slipping and sliding every once in a while. She had seen 1 or 2 hunters along the way, and hiding from them had been a challenge. Her heart seemed to leap with excitement when she saw the house with the Pokepastas just standing outside. They were training from how things looked, and when she stumbled into the clearing, he growled at her as she tried to get to her feet. Only then did a young boy from the group begin to walk over. "Who are you?" he called, seeming to have a muted voice laced with the echoes of dying people. Tin stood to her feet and asked a question in return. "Are you guys Lost Silver, E, and Loneliness?" "Who wants to know?" E snapped, earning him a glare from the armless boy. "Do we know you?" Silver asked more defensively. "You may know my master," Tin admitted, feeling slightly embarrassed as she talked. "His name is the Puppeteer." The other Eevee bounded forward, barely getting above the snow each time that he did. "Wait, he's an operator?" Tin smiled, nodding, earning a more eased expression from every member of the group. "Did he want something from us?" he asked, still seeming a bit suspicious of this sudden visit. Lonely seemed to read his worry, as did Silver before Tin could even respond. "I'm so sorry for the sudden visit," Tin said, placing a hand on her chest. "My name is Tin Doll. I was sent as a warning. Slenderman is coming under the assumption that you will work for the Hunters. He is intent on death." Tin suddenly froze, pulling the group into a rigid stillness until a voice cut through the silence. "That's enough from you and your master, Tin." The voice seemed to come out of nowhere until Tin was thrown against a nearby tree by a long black tendril. Lonely began to run back inside to retrieve Nova when E was suddenly grabbed. Silver promptly grabbed one of his gifted weapons to fight against the paper-colored demon, when his phantom limbs were suddenly torn off. Each attempt of any of the group to slow down Slender was met with immediate retaliation. Even the abilities Curse and Kill, along with the unknowns trying everything in their power, seemed to do absolutely nothing. It was when Slender had overwhelmed their minds that he spoke again. "None of you had a chance. Nova, get out here or your friends die!" Everything faded to black in their collective vision, as those were the last words that escaped Slender's mouth. When Nova had made her way downstairs and out her front door, she saw Silver lying face first in the dirt. E was on his side bleeding, and Loneliness was laying inches from the porch steps. Nova's eyes twitched, her vision even casting over to a large doll with her head bleeding against a tree near the edge of the clearing. "The fuck is this about, Slender?" she screamed in rage, seeing the faceless demon on the far edge of the clearing. Slender vanished, reappearing directly in front of her, tendrils suddenly wrapping around her in a tight vice-like grip. "That's rich coming from you, Miss Nova!" Slender hissed, lifting her up and pulling at her. Nova felt pain pulse throughout her body as his tentacles tightened around her. The waves between crushing squeezes led to minor cracking sounds. Although it felt like an eternity in his grasp, she managed to cover herself in a burning heat. Slender suddenly released her as she began to make her body heat rise. Slender cried out in agony as Nova stood to her feet in pain herself. "Quit whimpering, you bitch," she muttered, looking up at the demon in front of her. "Serves you right, especially when you tried to kill me over something I have nothing to do with." Slender charged at her in anger, causing her to dodge him as quickly as possible. He clipped her a few times before he began to make her vision blur. I've given you too much freedom, Miss Nova. So allow me to take it." Slender laughed, causing her to see things that weren't there. For a little bit, Nova seemed to be able to resist his hallucinations. It only seemed to be a minor inconvenience for her. It was as his rage rose that her movements became more clumsy. Nova struggled to focus, seeing his tendrils in front of her in one place only for them to blindside her in another direction. Nova tried to use her star vision only to have the hallucinations affect that ability too. As she would land an occasional hit, the hallucinations would get worse. She could feel her starting to get exhausted trying to keep up and overcome the hallucinations being forced onto her. It was when he pinned her, trying to punch holes into her body, that Nova wondered if this was it. Despair truly filled her for the first time in a couple of years, and it was odd, but she was fully intent on giving up. Her eyes began to close as pain filled her head and body, when the weight Slender had been placing on her seemed to leave. Her eyes opened, not seeing the paperwhite demon over top of her anymore. She looked around, seeing the scene that she had when leaving her house initially. This time was different, however, as her father stood between her and Slender. Nova carefully stumbled to her feet, starting to check on the others as she did. She heard Slender growl at her father. "This isn't your fight, Orion!" Slender exclaimed. "Even your father wouldn't have known this! This is mine!" Her father stood still, anger affecting the brightness of his glow. "You'd be surprised exactly how much of this falls into my domain, Slender. My father would have agreed." "Bullshit, you stupid Aster!" Slender closed in, holding back his urge to kill him, as breaking agreements with Asters would enter him and others into a losing war. "I am well aware of the Hunter situation, Slender," her father argued as calmly as possible, "and young Nova has nothing to do with them. My daughter may be a lot of things, but a hunter isn't one of them." Slender seemed dumbstruck by this revelation, allowing for Orion to explain further. "I asked her for her help. Exiled or not, she has agreed to the role of emissary, as well as soldier. These hunters wish to revive Ryzoth." Slender was filled with rage again. The idea with a war against him again would be devastating with lacking numbers of creepypastas. However, that didn't excuse Nova's actions against his allies and proxies. "What does that excuse?" he hissed. "She attacked my allies and proxies!" Nova spoke up, as she was making sure that E's side wound was patched properly for the time being. "The hunters were controlling them via collars. What was I supposed to do? Let them kill me? It wouldn't have helped anything, so I defended myself. Notice I didn't kill them." Slender and her father looked at her, as her tone was flat and matter-of-factly sounding, as she focused on what she was doing. Slender glared at her disregard for his position. He hated it. She began to walk over to loneliness when she went still. Lonely had stood up as she went rigidly still, and then she booked it inside. Slender was taken from the moment, seeing through the eyes of Ben, as they were briefly staring at a wall before going black suddenly. It seemed like he fell, but Slender didn't know for sure. It was more of a feeling than what he actually saw. "Do you mind if I follow her inside?" he asked Orion begrudgingly. "I don't mind. In fact, she may very well need our help, or mine at least." Orion seemed to blank out Slender from his mind as he followed his daughter, with Slender not far behind him. Slender, still concerned, not trusting Orion or Nova's explanations, as it just seemed too convenient. With Nova being the first one up the stairs, she could already hear someone freaking out. She booked it down the hallway into the room across from her, seeing Lou yell about Ben being on the floor, swearing without filter. Nova ran over to see the ghostly child was drowning. No water, he was just drowning. Nova knelt down, trying to think clearly between her own stress and Lou swearing every other word. "Okay," she muttered in frustration. "I can try to get him breathing, but this has to be a curse of some sort, and that being the case, I don't have the healing abilities I used to, and I..." Her thought process was cut off by a hand on her shoulder. Her father's, to be more specific. "I can dispel the curse." His voice was calm, and it seemed to bring down the tension in the room. "If you have any healing potions, it should be enough to finish the curse and reverse any and all damage." Nova blinked, giving her father a small smile before mumbling, "I'm glad you've changed, Papa." Orion hummed inquisitively as his daughter stood up to grab a potion from the closet in the room, though all he got in return was Nova shaking her head to tell him it wasn't important. Orion somehow could tell that wasn't true, but he continued dispelling the curse, allowing for Ben to breathe. As both the exiled Aster turned pasta and the current head of the Asters worked together, Slender seemed to be in awe. He had seen the powers of the Asters during the wars against Ryzoth years ago. But even watching the diminished Nova in this moment was intriguing. Orion had clearly taken after his father in regards to healing methods, chipping away at the damage slowly so as not to cause anything permanent. Nova on the other side of this exchange. Nova had to learn to use ingenuity when it came to her losses in power. Healing potions replaced most of her prior healing and self-healing abilities. She used her limitations as a means to invent new ways of survival, as she was now a creepypasta. As Ben began to look better, wounds that were previously not healing healed naturally in front of the group. Nova tried carefully to put him on the bed, only for Slender to do that for her. Her father and Nova looked over at the demon in confusion before he spoke. "I'm sorry," he said, sounding oddly embarrassed. "To both of you, really." Orion smiled, nodding, while Nova just gave him a pleasant smile. "I'm not the only one, though. And neither is his father," Nova admitted kindly. Slender nodded, knowingly, seeming to try not to look at her in the eyes. But Nova seemed to be okay with looking at the old demon. "Fear eats at us all," Orion adds. Nova would know. Nova gently elbowed her dad in the side, earning her a laugh as Slender finally looked at her. "You forgive me, then?" he asked, feeling weird as he did. Nova nodded, only replying, "I have a promise to keep, so holding a grudge wouldn't help me anyway. Let's begin anew, eh?" Slender nodded as the two of them discussed how to handle their new alliance. Orion slipped away in silence. Days passed between the event, with Nova coming and going from both her place and Slender's mansion. She would tell him about Ben's healing process, which was completed 3 days into her trips to and from the mansion, allowing for Ben to return home. She would tell Slender about Lou and his surprising change from wanting to kill her to sticking around. She even told Slender when the Pokepastas left to try to help her find more allies and to help others escape the hunters. She would tell Slender about Elf Forest and Silas, the rules of that market, and Slender would in turn give her hints on where hunters had been spotted to keep her safe on the way back to her house. She and Slender had even worked together to apologize to Puppeteer about what happened to Tin. The healing of her wounds was easy enough, but it felt weird to Nova that she had gone from saving a small group of Pokepastas to speaking with one of the most powerful operators of all. She had gone from no leads or allies to at least a few. Then, one day, about a week after her last meeting with Slender, at the time, she was training with Lou. "I still don't understand you, Nova," Lou said, whipping a knife at her hard. Nova dodged the knife with little effort. After sparring with him for so long now, this felt like a second nature. Ember just laid on the sidelines, sleeping and waiting for her turn. "What don't you understand exactly?" she asked, charging at him full speed. Lou dodged, tripping her to hopefully gain some edge on her this time. You kill other killers. It's your thing, right? So why haven't you targeted us exactly?" Nova rolled away from Lou's foot, threatening to slam down in her face. "I don't see you guys as any different from me for some reason. Maybe a little different based on origin story or whatever, but you all have a reason. Others, not so much. I don't understand it either." As Lou had become more trusting of Nova, he had found himself asking her more about herself, her past. It just interested him. She would often ask him questions in return, but both would eventually stop when they couldn't get the other one to answer anymore. As Nova got ready to attack again, preparing for his next question, the two of them were interrupted by a laugh. Lou nearly tripped over his own feet as Nova skidded to a halt. Both of them turned to see Puppeteer standing on the edge of the clearing. Sorry, you two have a fun way of communicating," Lou hissed at the sudden interruption, getting ready to head back inside when Pup added, "This concerns you too, I'm afraid. You'll want to stay." Lou paused, looking back at Puppeteer with an annoyed look. "What's all this about, Pup?" Nova asked calmly, not sure why he was dropping by after all the prior events. Lou finally fully faced the both of them, annoyance seeming to keep him silent this time. "After what happened with Tin, I understand the question," Puppeteer replied, walking closer to the two of them. "Slender and I have resolved things, so there's no need to worry. This is at least part of why I'm here." "Get on with it," Lou spoke in a numb tone, earning him his first major glare from Nova in a long time. Lou looked away from her, only to earn a quick chuckle from Puppeteer. "Let me get to the point then. Slender has extended an offer to the pastas in the area. He's allowing operators and other pastas to stay at his mansion during this time. As myself, Tin, and Soldier were chased from our home recently, that is where I'm going. My proxies were already sent ahead. But he did want me to extend this invitation to you directly. You don't have much time to make a decision, unfortunately, as I've seen hunters closing in on the area." Nova nodded. Thank you. You'll see us if we catch up." Puppeteer nodded, disappearing into the woods. Nova looked back at Lou, who had now dropped his annoyed demeanor due to this revelation. Looks like you and I have a decision to make, but I doubt that's going to be hard to decide. The two of them stared at each other briefly before heading inside to quickly talk it over. Hunters of Ryzoth, Chapter 4, Alliances and Whispers of War. So, what's the game plan? Lou asked, sounding a bit uneasy. Nova sighed, running her fingers through her hair. We need to assess whether or not the hunters are close enough to worry about or not. I do believe eventually we will be taking Slender up on his offer. Lou seemed to bristle at the thought of going to Slender's mansion at all. Lou, what's wrong? Nova asked, cocking her head a bit, trying to meet his newly adjusted gaze. Lou looked back up at Nova, nearly laughing at her inquisitive expression. Nova gave him a slightly annoyed glare, only resulting in him chuckling even more. Lou, she whined, getting him to shake his head, as Ember silently stalked into the room. It's just part of my past. I'm not sure I'm ready to face it yet, Lou finally admitted, earning him an understanding look from the former Aster. Okay, Nova said, rubbing the bridge of her nose in thought. I guess you and Jeff had it pretty rough. We don't even know if he's been freed either. You don't have to worry about that, a calm voice echoed in an ethereal manner. He's still under their control, that I can tell. Both Nova and Lou looked over at Ember, her eyes looking at both of them in an oddly calm way. Okay, this is the second time you've spoken, Ems, Nova replied, walking over and kneeling to her level. Lou watched the two of them, trying to piece together the same things Nova was. You picked me, Master, Nova said, bowing to her, and I'm grateful, so I'm trying to make things easier on you. Nova seemed to have a realization, causing her to go still, but not rigid. Yep, I need to learn to read things ahead of time, Nova said between small chuckles. Luke cleared his throat, getting the attention of both Nova and Ember. Okay, he said, looking at both of them annoyed. What do you mean, Nova? Ember began to growl, only for Nova to say, At ease, Ember. Ember looked away, slightly miffed, but silent nonetheless. I got Ember at Elf Forest when I saved Puppeteer. My objective at the time was to kill the previous head of the auction scene out there. And I just so happened to pick Ember. I just should have paid better attention to the fact that she was to be sold as a familiar. So you have a proxy, basically, Lou said, almost laughing, understanding the humor in the situation. Nova nodded, blushing slightly. Yep. Lou raised his hands apologetically. Sorry. She shook her head, only replying, I thought it was funny too. I just am feeling pretty embarrassed now. Lou nodded, though part of him knew that wasn't entirely true. Nova clapped her hands onto her face, before turning to Ember. Help me understand how you choose to use my powers in tandem with yours, she asked, calmly changing focus. Ember looked over excitedly. She leapt onto all fours in an almost playful way before saying, Your minor connection to plasma and radiation means I can feed off of fire to keep track of those you've come into contact with or people you've battled. So, I know which pastas you've battled and whether or not those hunters of Ryzoth still have control over them. Lou stifled his laughter as Ember bounced around like an excited puppy. Nova smirked, trying not to laugh herself. as she asked, "So if we were to train together, you'd be able to access more combative abilities similar to mine?" Ember barked, not talking anymore, as she was overjoyed by this conversation. Nova and Lou laughed a little as Ember slowly calmed down, seeming to be very embarrassed. "Oi, puppy," Lou called, knowing that she would potentially snap at him. "What?" Ember growled, half growling and half barking. Her jaws snapped loudly in her anger, as Lou replied, choosing not to flinch. "We were laughing because we thought you were being cute. Take it as a compliment, would ya?" Ember looked away, but said, "Fine, I guess." Nova sighed, just relieved that a huge fight wasn't ensuing. "One more question, Ember," Nova asked, relief still evident on her face. Ember looked toward the two of them, practically giving them a side-eye to try to look dignified. Nova sighed at this cute display, but shook off the urge to gush about it out loud. This might be a bit of a stretch, but can you tell me what the Hunter's plans are? On travel, anyway?" Ember faced the both of them more fully this time, her tail laying behind her still. She looked a bit lost in thought, seeming to process the request she had been given. She bowed her head, seeming to look like she felt bad. I'm sorry. I only know where two groups of those people are, and even then, the ability doesn't spread beyond people you fought or come into contact with." Nova was about to tell her that it was all okay, when Lou came over to pat her on the head. "Knowing Nova," he said, his gaze seeming gentle, "she knows that you only can do so much. She's not mad." Nova smiled at Lou's surprising display, when Ember licked his hand and looked over to her. "He's right. I mean, geez, I was the goofball that didn't know I had a familiar for this long," Nova admitted, laughing a little. Ember pounced on her, licking her face, only to stop occasionally to thank her. Lou watched this and snuck a photo with a phone he had stolen during one of his last kills. After things had calmed down, the group resumed discussions about what to do next. "Okay, so if we're going to Slender's, do we leave now or later?" Lou asked. Nova placed a hand on her chin in thought, then sighed. "We'll need supplies, and regardless of how close they are, we'll need to travel on foot anyway." "More trips to Elf Forest?" Ember asked, looking at her with a fearful look. "We can't avoid it, unfortunately," Nova admitted to Ember. "That said, you'll be safe, you know." Ember nodded, though her fears were still evident on her face. "So long haul for travel, though that makes sense considering how long between being home and being at Slender's was over." "So long haul for travel, though that makes sense considering how long between being home and being at Slender's over the past several months." Nova nodded. "You'll be coming with me too, you know." Lou nodded begrudgingly, though his confidence in leaving was a bit better now. "With that settled," Nova said, addressing them both, "if we run out of time, what do we want to do for a game plan?" "Honestly," Lou spoke first, "since we can't kill anybody, granted hunters are excluded from that rule, we should try running towards Slender's off of the typical path you take." Ember barked for clarification. "You mean one of the paths you explored while Nova was gone?" Lou nodded, causing Nova to pull out a map that she had made ages ago, when she first found this place. It looked a little childish, but Nova had pride that she could do better this time. Lou covered his mouth, a smile creeping across it as he barely prevented himself from laughing. Nova shot him a glare, saying, "I have been practicing cartography since then, so shove it." Lou shook his head, his shoulders shaking between stifled laughter. Sorry, he said, trying not to have his laughter grow. "Okay, are you gonna redraw the map?" Nova gave him a look that gave him his answer, only causing him to burst out laughing. Nova crossed her arms in annoyance, watching him gradually regain his composure. "Oh, God!" he exclaimed, finally able to breathe. "Sorry, it's just not what I expected." Nova sighed, rubbing her temples and shaking off her annoyance. Then she gazed at the old map that she had made. Nova smirked, now feeling a little less vulnerable about his laughter. "Right," Nova said calmly. "Where are these paths you found, Lou?" In between laughter and confusion, Nova was able to mark them on the map. Around the time that Lou had gone to bed, Nova had sneaked back down the stairs and began rifling through her things quietly. "What are you doing?" Ember yawned, woken up by the noise. "Sorry, Ember," Nova whispered, looking into the glowing eyes of the blaze hound. "I was just looking for a new sheet to redraw the old map." Nova returned to her search. Ember stretched before leaving the room. She had seen some large chunks of paper lying around earlier. She was almost certain that Nova had forgotten about them completely when she found them. She carefully wrapped her jaws around them before returning to her slightly annoyed master. Nova looked over, seeing Ember holding a large sheet of paper. Ember put the paper down gently and whispered almost inaudibly, "These are in the basement. I believe you forgot you had them." Nova had never investigated the home too deeply. She had only made it a base and was used to finding hidden treasures in its walls. "Thanks, Ember," she replied, petting the skull head of the dog and the fur in between the ribs. "I still have a bit of investigation to do into this old place before we leave for good." Ember's tail lightly thumped on the floor until the petting stopped. Then she said, "No problem, Nova," before returning to lay down and sleep. Nova took a deep breath before walking into the kitchen with the old map and new paper. She turned on the light so it was only dimly lit and began to rework the map. She felt exhausted by the time she had finished it at 2:30 a.m. and finally crawled into bed. Later in the day, she was scolded by Lou for her poor sleeping habits, only for her to retort with the fact that they had only ever killed at night anyway. A day or two later, they spent several hours getting Lou's blades reforged and strengthened, then gathering food and other supplies for their trek to Slender's. When they got home, they used the new map to determine the best path there, and the best escape paths if things got too dangerous. It's a whole week later when they had to flee, as the hunters surrounded the house at 3 a.m. "Nova!" Lou's voice whispered harshly into Nova's ear. Nova looks at him, more awake than one might expect, as she usually was a sound sleeper. "What?" she asked in near silence. Ember whined, giving Nova all the info she needed. "Okay, grab what you can," she ordered bluntly. "Leave the lights off, and we'll meet by the back door." Lou nodded, quickly and quietly leaving her room like a ghost was chasing him. Nova shot to her feet and signaled for Ember to come over to her. Ember trotted over while barely silencing her footsteps. "I know you just started to be able to use your pseudo version of Star Vision, but please use it for as long as possible when we go grab stuff to go." Ember didn't bark. She just gave her a hasty nod before leaving the room to start keeping watch. Nova sneaked herself over to her closet and threw her hoodie onto the bed, not planning to change with there being no time to spare. She sucked in a breath, looking around her room wildly to make sure her black and red combat boots were there. When she spotted them by the door, she sighed in relief before getting down on her hands and knees to reach under her bed. As her hands searched for what she was looking for desperately, she could hear the hunters moving. Come on, 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 she muttered impatiently until she felt a leather binding of an old journal that she had collected many months ago. You'd think since I've had you since early November, and it's now March, that I'd found you quicker, she breathed out in frustration. She grabbed an old leather backpack from the closet, where she kept a few clothes and belongings, and hastily began shoving what she could into it. After she had, Ember scrambled into her room, Ember scrambled into her room, following large cracking and banging sounds. Ember scrambled into her room, following loud cracking and banging sounds by the front door. Time to go, Nova demanded, following the Blazehound downstairs. Lou was waiting for them as the hunters entered the house. They left. The hunters took notice, sending the mind-controlled groups after the three. They booked it for the emergency path they had laid out, only for it to be blocked off. They were being cornered when a set of golden threads began to dangle from the trees. The group had only a few seconds to look up and see Puppeteer on Slender's shoulder in the trees. They didn't even have time to process what they were seeing when they suddenly found themselves outside of a large mansion. We heard those guys were coming for you, Puppeteer said coolly, whilst jumping off his perch on Slender's shoulder. Though he insisted on the plan, and it went well. You aren't to speak of this, Slender said in a semi-venomous voice. Nova wanted to laugh, wondering how Pup had convinced Slender to let him ride on his shoulders. But she didn't dwell on it, only nodding. Slender sighed in agitation, and then said, "Make yourselves comfortable. In any of the empty bedrooms, please. I'll send Kate and Charles to check on you three later." Not more than a second later, he vanished, leaving them outside the large, eerie-looking place. Puppeteer only giggled, going to follow Slender inside, while the other three studied the outside. The place was mostly dark gray and black. Twisted vines crawled up the large walls, and the windows were lit ominously. The place dripped with a foreboding aura, and the main door sat slightly ajar to let them in. "Well, got here quicker than we expected, huh?" Lou asked, breaking their collective silence. Nova nodded, turning to look at Lou, then noting his tension had returned. "We'll be fine," Nova said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "He's not going to cause any problems given the circumstance." Lou gave her a nervous smile, only to reply, saying, "That may be true, but not everyone's going to have the same mindset." Ember leaned her head into his hand, deciding to have her own input. "We've got each other's backs, so if things go up in flames, we'll be able to confront it." Lou and Nova smiled, more calmly and confidently, and then the three headed inside. The place was cleaner than one might expect, the same dark theme filling the house's interior, but all in all, it held a slightly different feel. The group of three found themselves taking pauses in front of some of the rooms, but even Ben's, which allowed them to see the tired pasta sleeping. Most of the rooms they did look at were empty, but also some of them seemed to have missing inhabitants. Eventually, the group of three found 2 rooms adjacent to each other, with Lou stating while they looked that he wanted them to be nearby. Lou chose the room closest to a room a few feet away. A white door seemed to mark its place, with Nova's slightly larger room directly on the opposite side. "Good luck on settling in, Nova," he said nearly numbly. Nova gave him a sympathetic look and said, "You too. Drop in any time, though just make sure to knock." "I know," Lou said smugly, disappearing into his chosen room before Nova could tell him off. Nova just smiled, shaking her head and looking down at Ember. "Shall we?" she asked, getting a nod from the Blaze Hound before they headed inside. The room had a single bed on the left-hand corner, right next to the window. A vanity sat on the opposite wall, with a closet close to the door they had just entered. Nova had begun to sort through her belongings in silence, while Ember had fallen asleep next to the bed. As Nova dug through her bag, she found the journal. She had heard someone clearing their throat behind her. Nova had found the journal before turning to face Slender, who stood behind her calmly. "What can I do for you, Mr. Slender?" she asked, kind of stunned by his sudden drop-in. "The puppeteer and I would like to speak with you, if you don't mind, Nova," Slender asked calmly and quietly. Nova nodded, sensing the movement of Ember behind her. She signaled for her to stay put. Slender silently led her to a room on the other side of the house that appeared to be like an office. He calmly motioned her inside before saying, "This isn't going to be the only place where a meeting would be held, but with where we are right now, it made the most sense." Nova smiled at his business-like demeanor, about the whole thing. Nova smiled at his business-like demeanor about the whole thing. She thought it was interesting that he felt the need to explain. "No need to explain to me," Nova replied calmly, a strange level of respect coming from her voice. "It's your space, and I thank you for sharing it." As Nova walked into the room, she couldn't help but wonder if Slender were human, would he have smiled? That question faded quickly when Puppeteer spoke up, reaching his hand out to shake hers. "Good to see you again, Miss Nova, even if we haven't been apart for very long." She laughed softly, noting that he was just trying to diffuse the tension with a bit of humor. "You too, darling Puppeteer," she joked back, earning her a genuine laugh. Slender cleared his throat, wanting to get down to business, so the two of them focused. With reintroductions out of the way, we have quite a bit to discuss. He had a matter-of-factly tone while speaking. Where to begin, though, Slendy?" Puppeteer asked. His tone held the slightest bit of annoyance. Slender seemed to growl slightly before Nova cleared her throat loudly, startling the both of them. "Boys, put your badges away. What topic do we start with at this juncture?" Both of them looked at each other, and then seemed to sigh in annoyance with her briefly. "What do we know about those callers, Miss Nova?" Slender asked, breaking the silence. "You've already experienced one of the side effects with Ben," Nova started. "However, this will be a case-by-case basis, with almost any ghost or undead individual. Callers are set up with curses that hunters use to control those who they have placed them on. This particular problem pertains to more undead, ghosts, or zombies, human dolls, etc. With demons and others, they strictly limit their individual thought or abilities unless instructed to allow them to use them. Remover of the collars can injure those who they have control over to varying degrees, and it's just that the curses do the most damage to those who have died and come back. Damage done to others will mainly come from the wearer's resistance to orders or control. We need to prepare for every scenario. With Silver, was it different? Puppeteer asked, curiosity filling his mind. Nova shook her head, only to answer, no, as Silver, E, and Loneliness weren't being controlled, but were being attacked by a mob of mind-controlled pastas. Nova, as she finished the sentence, the door to Slender's office creaked open, revealing a half-skeletal boy that Slender Puppeteer knew all too well. Nova looked at the boy, and a child once filled with such promise and a future even. She noted the proxy symbol crudely etched into the remaining skin on his neck. Then his voice entered the room, a mix of a young boy and sobbing sounds leaving his mouth as he spoke. Is everything gonna be okay? I know I'm not supposed to be in here, but are we going to? His voice trailed off. Nova felt a mixture of empathy, sympathy, sadness, and concern. Nova saw Slender's movements from the corner of her eyes, and felt his anger as he stood. The boy flinched, seeming to know what was coming, when Nova calmly stood up and got between them. What's your name, kiddo? She asked, in a tone that came naturally to her, even after 2 years of butchering and murdering others. The boy looked back at his master, who froze behind the lady, whom he perceived to be very nice. He giggled a little, and then answered, I'm Charlie, but my full first name is Charles. Nova smiled softly, pulling the boy's attention away from Slender altogether. Well, Charlie, she said sweetly, we're going to do everything that we can. I know that you're scared, but you're stronger than you think. Charles laughed, leaving the room while saying, Thank you. The door closed behind him. Once his footsteps could no longer be heard, Slender spoke up. You didn't have to deal with my proxy. I could have handled him. The anger was evident in his voice, causing Puppeteer to watch both of them in a trance of sorts. He wondered if a fight would break out, dissolving the discussion they were having entirely. Nova stood up, turning on her heels to face the demon, who was much taller than her. Your proxy was scared, same as you, and you were going to boldly and maybe even violently punish him for entering the room, Nova said, her gaze seeming to pierce through the faceless demon without fear. Do you deny it? Slender didn't answer, only eventually standing down after what felt like several minutes. He cleared his throat shortly after the event. With the knowledge of the callers, what do we have? How do we proceed? We need more firepower, and the risk of proxies being controlled is too high. Nova seemed to relax back into the conversation, like nothing had happened at all. Puppeteer following her odd example. Unfortunately, that's true, Puppeteer added. Both of my proxies would easily be victims of the curses they can inflict, as would your only 2 remaining proxies. We might be able to find out more if we could gain some more trust from outsiders who weren't captured, Nova added, seeming to hint at a few other pastas that were likely to be imprisoned. Slender seemed to groan at the thought, but nodded in a way that told her that they would look into that. Slender seemed to groan with a nod. Slender seemed to groan at the thought, but nodded in a way that told her that they would look into that next. With that in mind, Slender said, deciding to change subjects again. Do we know any information on weaknesses for Ryzoth? If the worst is to pass, as it stands, Asters were only barely able to banish him, even with our help. Nova, you do know the most about him, Puppeteer added, looking at her. Nova was about to say that she had something she needed to retrieve from her room, when she remembered it was on the chair she had left behind while comforting Charles. I'd lose my head if it wasn't attached to my body, Nova said sheepishly, reaching to grab the journal off the chair and place it on Slender's desk. What's that? Puppeteer asked inquisitively, reaching his hand out to touch it. Slender glared at him. Nova explained. That journal comes from the father of a young girl. As you know, Slender, Asters are given the job of protecting humans. On my only job, the young girl was killed by her father. It was over 2 years ago now. He had abused her and then killed her to be a vessel for Ryzoth. His death was a mixture of my rage and a promise not to let him do that to anyone else. When my father brought Ryzoth back to my attention in October, I had explored the old house. Hunters were searching it too, but the journal seems to hold rituals for summoning Ryzoth. It's the only information I have, but I have never been able to decipher it. Slender carefully picked up the journal, skimming the pages briefly before saying, It'll take me some time, but I think I'll be able to figure it out. As they were both about to discuss what their next steps were, when finding the information, they heard people freaking out. Slender, Nova, and Puppeteer quickly left the room behind to investigate. Ben was the first one to leave his room after seeing Ember run by, with Lou close behind her. He didn't know much about the strange demonic dog, other than the fact that she had been sticking close to Nova when he was still healing at her place. Ember! Lou cried after her, trying to get her to slow down, but she wasn't having it. You a new master or something? Ben joked, earning him an annoyed glare from Lou. The glare sent a minor shudder through Ben. It reminded him of the multiple times that Jeff would kick his ass for stupid jokes. No, she bothered me, then took off, Lou replied, still chasing her. Ben was thoroughly confused now, not by Lou, but by the strange demon's behavior. When they got downstairs and out the now open front door, they saw Ember barking at a group. Among them was Silver, E, Loneliness, Eyeless Jack, Smile Dog, and Zero. Silver had a few deep wounds across his torso. Lonely had a blade sticking out of his side and was limping. Meanwhile, E had one of his eyes hanging from his body. EJ, laying limp on Evie's back, seemed to be soaked in blood. Zero wore her scarf, but only to stop the bleeding from her side. And Smile was dragging himself along while his own blood dripped from his mouth. Fairly close to the immediate group was a woman in a black nurse's outfit. A black mask with a red cross in the middle was evident. She seemed to jump between injuries, trying to keep all of the group members alive. Ember's barking stopped when Ben approached the group. "The fuck happened, Silver?" he cried, as he seemed to manifest something from his game and began to heal. E laid down slowly as not to injure himself or the man on his back more. "They had a bit more firepower than we could handle," E muttered, feeling dizzy from his awkward vision. "The hunters attacked us directly," Lonely rasped, attempting not to lay on the blade. "They used bats and cursed weapons." Long story short, Silver winced as Ben treated his wound. "We bit off more than we could chew. There was definitely demonic energy behind those weapons they used." As this conversation finished, Slender, Puppeteer, and Nova were outside. "Ben," Slender called, earning Ben's attention. "Make sure everyone gets inside." Ben didn't argue, nodding before returning to try to heal his fellow gaming pastas. We have to discuss our alliance agreement despite the timing of everything," Puppeteer mumbled calmly. Slender sighed begrudgingly at this, but didn't argue, and turned to Nova. "I assume you're going to help them then." Nova nodded, and Slender left with Puppeteer. As she looked around, she could see Lou was trying to figure out how to help, and noted that the nurse clothed in black. She was about to offer her assistance when a familiar voice filled the area. It was weakened and raspy sounding. "Seems like War's whispering loudly lately." Nova's eyes cast over to the red and black demon husky. She was about to tell him to conserve what little strength he had, when Ember was suddenly in front of him. "Save your strength, Smile," Ember growled at him sternly. Nova watched their interaction carefully, making sure that things weren't going to take a turn for the worst. "Why should I listen to..." Smile started to argue, only to cough up blood. Ember chuckled triumphantly as Smile became silent, and Nova shook her head with a smile before walking up to Lou and the young nurse. "Lou, go up to my room and grab my bags. There should be some stuff in there." Lou would have argued, but he really didn't know what to do otherwise, so he left to retrieve her bag. The nurse looked up at her, piercing red eyes glinting under the moonlight. Nova kneeled down next to her as the woman's gaze followed. "How can I be of help, miss?" Nova asked, causing the woman to stare at her slightly harder. And you're helping why?" she asked, her voice sounding numb and annoyed. Nova didn't let her tone bother her. She just replied, "We have to stick together, whether you like it or not. Those hunters will kill all of us. So if I can help, I'm going to help." Anne sighed, giving her instructions as she worked. Those instructions extended to Lou when he came back. Once the group members were all stable enough, they were brought safely and carefully inside. Hello, Tesla Cats. Welcome to the end of the video. Now, let's talk about the current state of Hunters of Ryzoth. Now, like I said, this was going to just be a brief update anyway, but I have really been enjoying recording and writing this series, but my brain will sometimes do dumb things, so I'll take a bit of a break. Which is pretty much what happened with this, is I took a bit of a break, and then I eventually remembered to come back to it. Also, I apologize again for the last part kind of being a bit phoned in and not as well edited as previous parts. I was really tired, and I just kind of got the spur-of-the-moment decision to record it, so I recorded it, and then I didn't feel like editing the pictures properly, so I apologize for that. But with that said, the series, as I've stated in previous videos, is never going to be monetized. Not because I don't have confidence in the series or anything, but because there is a lot of fan art that makes its way into these videos. Most of it from DeviantArt, and other things are in the public domain because I've been able to find public domain images for certain things. To be specific, I've found the forest image that I used in the first episode and the black hole image that I've used in every episode involving Nova, or for the most part during the series. Those are public domain, but everything from the picture of E to the picture I used for Loneliness and any creepypasta character has been a fan art by another creator, and that is just one of the reasons. The other reason is because of the level of violence, things where I've mentioned abuse in this series, or other things, I wouldn't feel comfortable trying to monetize it in the current climate of YouTube. It just wouldn't happen. With that said, I am currently at a bit of a crossroads. One,
I love writing the series, but one, I am kind of torn and not sure as to what ideas or what to do next. I have a vague idea of what I want to do next for the next chapter, and I'll try to write it, but I don't know. I'm not entirely sure where I want to go from here. I know for a fact that the way I want the series to end, I want it to kind of have a bittersweet ending. A lot of you guys are aware of the gaming pasta of the Godzilla gaming pasta of, if I can remember the name, Godzilla NES, and how it kind of has a bittersweet ending. And yes, I do consider it a bittersweet. Like, there's a creepy factor, but to me, it didn't come off as creepy when I watched it through the YouTuber I watched it through. And it just kind of had this bittersweet ending of, like, this is the creator, this is what they decided to do, and it's kind of sad, but it makes a certain amount of sense. I know that's what I want to do with mine. I'm not intending on there being ships in this series. That is not the main intent or the main purpose of this series. But yeah, I don't entirely know what I want to do. I know kind of what Ryzoth is as a character, that a lot of things that are going on will require my mixture of my Aster species with creepypastas and them fighting off this demon. But I don't quite know how to get from point A to point B to point C. So if you guys have any suggestions or feedback, please leave that in the comments down below. Of course, subscribe if you want to see more content like this one. And I think that's about all I have to say currently. I'm sorry for the really long update on this series, and I promise that I will get get the next episode up as soon as possible. I might wait a couple of weeks though, because obviously I'm having this go up first. But that's about it. Remember to keep on keeping on, and I'll see you Tesla Cats, and anyone who's not subscribed and just watches this series in passing, in the next one. Bye now!